Chapter 386. The accumulated dust blew out of the cracks in the stone path. In the eyes of many people, they were large and long swords arranged in front of palace attendant Rome. Many of the cultivators who had come today were hidden experts who rarely left their sections. At this time, their expressions changed slightly and they narrowed their eyes. They had underestimated this palace attendant Rome before, but now they knew they were wrong. This palace attendant Rome was an old person in Chongling. She had experienced the most glorious and bloodiest era. Also, the cultivators she had seen were the top cultivators of their time. She had personally experienced the prosperity of the Bazinkindo ground group and also saw the demise of the Bazinkindo ground. Perhaps she had also handled many top-notch sword manuals. Her actions reminded all the cultivators that people with such experiences were destined to be extraordinary. Just like how any retainer or carriage driver under those people in the past was very powerful to the outside world. This palace attendant was also very powerful. So powerful it surpassed the boundaries of their imagination. The large blurry swords formed from the dust gave off real murderousness. They layered like walls in front of palace attendant Rome. This was a sword formation that could both attack and defend. A sword formation like this could even split the energy surging towards palace attendant Rome into countless layers, much less flying swords. Even Huang Jinwei on the turret felt it could not be defeated. In his view, if Ding Ning wanted to defeat this palace attendant, he could only rely on flying swords. But the distance between Ding Ning and palace attendant Rome was less than 10 feet. This kind of distance was nothing to a Realm 6 cultivator. In palace attendant Rome's perception, there was no distance between her and Ding Ning. The large swords filled the space between her and Ding Ning. With her next thought, these swords would press towards Ding Ning. Compared to her sword formation, Ding Ning was like a small boat facing a storm in the ocean. Everyone felt that there was no way he could fight back, except for Jing Liuli and Yi Zhengnan who followed behind him. Their eyes fell on the iron box behind Ding Ning. At this moment, Ding Ning opened the iron box. A sword shadow flew out of the iron box at the right time. This sword shadow was very small and light green in color, like a small piece of moss, appearing soft and powerless. This sword shadow met the sword formation that was moving towards it. Facing the first large sword, it was like a thin and soft dagger gently brushing against a wall. The thin and soft dagger scratched against the moving wall. At most, it could cut off some of the wall's ash. How could it stop the wall from moving forward? However, with just a light stroke, the entire wall was broken. This light green sword shadow silently sliced apart the first large sword that was coming at him. Gasps of disbelief could be heard. The pupils of all the cultivators who could react contracted. They did not dare to believe that this indifferent sword shadow had such power. They did not have time to react. They did not know where Ding Ning's sword shadow came from. As their gasps sounded and disbelief spread, Ding Ning gave them an answer. A sword light flew out of the iron box. Most of the people present were familiar with this broken sword, which was covered in countless fine white flowers. But in the senses of many powerful cultivators, this remnant sword was very different from usual. The color of this sword had not changed at all, but it gave them a sense of mottled feeling. There were countless flat cracks on the last flower remnant sword. These cracks formed when the sword was broken, like seal scripts that penetrated the entire sword and spread all the way to the hilt. These cracks had originally been very flat. If the sword threads had not spread, if the fine white flowers had not bloomed in the cracks, they would not have been visible. But today, in the senses of these powerful cultivators, the cracks on this sword were not flat. The sword threads seemed to have been tied into different knots to form this sword. The cracks were no longer completely flat. There were different shadows on the sword, so in the senses of these people, it became mottled. Just as the first moss-like sword shadow silently landed on the moving sword wall, a knot on the last flower remnant sword disappeared the moment it flew out of the iron box. Then a sword shadow flew out of the last flower remnant sword like a patch of gray-white wall dust. This sword shadow that looked like gray wall ash also fell into the sword formation. It stuck to a huge sword that was pressing down, and then it crushed this huge sword. Palace attendant Rong's sword formation was enormous, and had accumulated her many years of resentment and the courage to risk everything after losing everything, even her life. Compared to this sword formation, these sword shadows were still too small and weak. But the sword essences contained in these sword shadows were all-powerful, so powerful they caused people to tremble. Some sword essences seemed to have the power to change the laws of energy ahead and directly shattered the incoming sword. And there were many of these sword shadows. Modeled sword shadows were released from the last flower remnant sword one after another, stabbing towards the sword formation. There was a loud bang. An enormous fatty seemed to appear in the sword shadows. Like a mountain, he crushed the entire sword formation into chaos. Palace attendant Rong's peerless attack was defeated just like that. Borrowing sword essence? Someone reacted and cried out. However, most of the cultivators who reacted knew that the voice he shouted was wrong. Borrowing sword essence could only use vital energy to activate some remnant sword essence that had just been used. It was like simulating some presence. So this was controlling sword essence. In all of Feng Ho province, supposedly, only Feng Shimu could comprehend this secret sword. Using sword seals to obtain true sword essence and use it against enemies. The knots on Ding Ning's last flower remnant sword were seals made from sword threads. So in this moment, he seemed to have borrowed the swords of many experts. For example, the sword essence that had completely crushed the sword formation caused people to think of the blow marquee Su had used against Yi's ceiling on the street. Ding Ning, is he really Feng Xiaomu's direct disciple? Someone could not help but shout. Palace attendant Rong's heart contracted violently. When the first sword essence flew out of the metal box behind Ding Ning, goosebumps rose on her skin. The intense shock caused her heart to bleed even more. Her lips were tender and alluring. There was a deafening boom. Her sword formation was defeated in a flash. At this time, two more powerful sword essences charged through the shattered sword formation and fell towards her body. One was the great furnace of the world. An enormous wave rose into the sky. These were the sword essences of Zhao Zhan and Yi Sealing. This was a true battle of life and death between the two, and the last blow that would decide life and death. These two sword essences appeared at the same time. They did not collide, but attacked the same enemy at the same time. There was no sound as water and fire mixed. Yet when Ding Ning activated his vital energy, he brought out power that did not belong to his realm. Palace attendant Rong had no time to think. Her hands pushed forward. A presence unique to her life bond sword surged out of her palm. There was still no sound. However, an exceptionally beautiful flame bloomed in front of her. This was a glowing ball of water exploding outwards. Inside the ball of water, there were countless dazzling red lines of fire. With a muffled grunt, Palace attendant Rong's blood-red lips flew out. Her body was thrown back like a kite. The circle of black umbrellas quickly moved backwards, causing gasps due to the pressure. The area of battle had expanded. The empty space that had been given up was not enough. Fortunately, the people at the front were almost all cultivators. This kind of pressure did not cause them to fall to the ground or get trampled and cause more chaos. The ball of water exploded into countless droplets of water. The water droplets were burned by the lines of fire and turned into balls of steam. Palace attendant Rong's eyes narrowed into slits. A sword light danced in the pure, white energy and shot towards her. This was Ding Ning's last flower remnant sword, his flying sword. But at this time, Ding Ning's figure disappeared into the mist in front of her. Chapter 387. Palace attendant Rong did not pay attention to Ding Ning. The area within 30 feet of her was her world. It was absolutely impossible for Ding Ning to get within 30 feet of her without being discovered. Even more importantly, there was a great disparity in power between Ding Ning and her. Ding Ning could only use his flying sword to threaten her, so she only needed to deal with Ding Ning's flying sword. The moment she narrowed her eyes, her perception accurately captured this lightning-fast flying sword. She swung her sword. Her life-bond sword had completely formed in her hand. It was a short sword that was about 2 feet long. It was a withered yellow with a hint of burnt yellow, just like the color of a withered banana leaf in autumn. However, its surface emitted a white porcelain luster, appearing incomparably cold. When she swung her sword, a clear arc of light appeared in the air ahead of her. A wild wind suddenly surged. All the steam, including some lines of fire that had not been extinguished, were blown away. The area in front of her was clear. Ding Ning's figure was not there. Jing Liuli and Yi Jingnan were still standing in the shadows under the eaves by the door. At this time, a faint layer of sword light stood in front of Jing Liuli and Yi Jingnan like a large blade, blocking the steam and lines of fire blowing towards them. Ding Ning's figure was not in front of them, nor was the large metal box. No one knew if Ding Ning had retreated to the courtyard behind him or hidden in the surrounding streets. But the flying sword with fine white flowers blooming on the sword threads was still in the air. This remnant sword was like a dragonfly in the wild wind, swaying and about to fall. Palace attendant Rong had finished one attack. If she swung her life-bond sword again, Ding Ning's flying sword would be sent flying to an unknown location. But in this moment, the sound of something hard breaking sounded. This sound came from behind Palace attendant Rong. All the spectating cultivators looked in shock and puzzlement behind Palace attendant Rome. While it was summer, pieces of shattered ice and snow exploded behind Palace attendant Rome. Thump, 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 thump. Palace attendant Rome landed forward. The soles of her shoes hit the ground and caused cloth to fly up. After a few steps, she stopped. Her feet were stuck in a pile of rubble, and 2 deep ravines appeared behind her. The clothes on her back were also torn. A few drops of blood hung on the torn cloth under the sunlight, looking very sparkling and dazzling. Most people couldn't understand what had happened in that instant, and they let out a series of exclamations. Palace attendant Rome frowned, coughed softly, and spat out a mouthful of turbid air. When she sensed the bone-deep chilliness behind her, as well as the remaining aura on the ice that was slowly melting on her flesh, she raised her head slightly, her voice slightly cold as she said to herself, "Cold cicada transformation." At this time, the flying sword in the wild wind that had already dissipated in front of her suddenly accelerated. It did not fall towards her body, but directly smashed into the stone pavement below like a meteor. There was a loud boom. Just as the flying sword touched the stone pavement, many sparks appeared under Palace attendant Rome's feet. Some of the dust and rubble that flew up started to burn, turning into molten lava that burned towards Palace attendant Rome's body. All of Palace attendant Rome's emotions disappeared from her face, and she became absolutely cold again. Primal energies of the universe quickly flowed out of her body, evenly and densely wrapping around her body like a true porcelain shell. Countless sparks gushed out from under her feet like a fountain, striking the porcelain shell. However, they were unable to penetrate it and splashed out in all directions. If it wasn't for the fact that it was a scorching hot summer day, it would definitely be a beautiful scene. Hell draw on the turret. Huang Jinwei's attention was completely attracted by Ding Ning's flying sword. The name of this secret sword appeared in his mind, and his heart beat violently. But a kind of nervousness and regret spread through his body. The difference in power between Ding Ning and Palace attendant Rome was too great. The sword essence created by a secret sword like this could not even break through Palace attendant Rome's protective energy. Just as this thought flashed through his mind, another explosion came from Palace attendant Rome's body. The flying sword that flew up from the ground accelerated at a terrifying speed, stabbing towards Palace attendant Rome's forehead. The moment Palace attendant Rome coldly swung the sword, the flying sword was still accelerating, but suddenly turned on its spot and created a comet-like sword light. Palace attendant Rome's life-bond sword did not cut the flying sword, just the comet-like sword light. The sword light was cut off, but the sword essence did not dissipate. A streak of sword light struck her face, but it still wasn't able to break through the porcelain-like radiance around her body. However, it left behind a red mark on her face. She seemed to have been slapped in the face. Palace attendant Rong looked up and walked into a side alley. She was certain that Ding Ning had not retreated to the courtyard behind Jing Lioli and had hidden in that alley. Ding Ning's flying sword flew back at this time. Then it released light for no reason. In an instant, the light was so dazzling that it was hard to imagine. It was like a sun had fallen. The light was so white that people felt the liquid in their eyes would evaporate when they closed their eyes. There was a light cracking sound. When the blinding light dissipated, and everyone could see again, waves of gasps sounded. A shallow wound appeared on the left side of Palace Attendant Rong's abdomen. Blood was slowly flowing out. Palace Attendant Rong's left foot was raised, and a layer of vital energy seeped out of her right foot, lifting her body off the ground. This sudden wound caused her to grunt. For the first time, she felt pain on her face. The flying sword, which had already flown several feet away from her, suddenly shook. With just a tremor, several invisible waves in the air violently bombarded her body. Palace Attendant Rong's body flew forward. This time, she could not control her balance and hit a wall in front of her. Ding Ning's flying sword disappeared like a ghost, charging into the spreading dust. Palace Attendant Rong's figure appeared out of the dust in the next moment. Another small wound appeared on her face. All the spectating experts, and even the academicians of the Astrology Bureau under the black umbrellas at the front, were shocked. Winter Cicada Transformation, Hell Guide, Comet Tail, Corona Sword, Jade Cutting Sword, Sky Wave, Backlight Sword, Dust Concealment, one secret sword after another. Everyone could imagine that Ding Ning would use his flying sword to deal with Palace Attendant Rong. Yet no one had expected Ding Ning to use his flying sword so well. It was one secret sword after another that seemed to never stop. Ordinary flying sword arts either pursued lightning-fast speed, strangeness, or concealment. For a cultivator who had just grasped the flying sword, it was already very difficult to be outstanding in any of these, let alone a flying sword secret art that could trigger the unique power of energy. What shocked these cultivators the most was that these flying sword secret arts did not come from the same sect. The Winter Cicada Transformation came from Min Mountain Sword Sect. The Hell Guide was the sword essence of the Zhao. The Comet Tail was the sword essence of the former Han. The Jade Cutting Sword came from the Fong Marquisate establishment. These flying sword secret arts that came from different cultivation places were perfectly displayed in the hands of one person who had just entered Realm 5. If they had not seen this with their own eyes, they would not have believed it even if it reached their ears. Palace Attendant Rong's wounds were very small. All these cultivators knew that these wounds could not pose any real threat to her. However, the blood that flowed out from these wounds also caused the clothes on her body to become scarlet red. She already looked miserable. Even more importantly, this flying sword had been facing Palace Attendant Rong from beginning to end. Now, she could not even see Ding Ning. These spectating cultivators even started to sympathize with this palace attendant. They unconsciously wondered if she would be slowly killed by Ding Ning's flying sword without seeing Ding Ning's shadow from beginning to end. At this time, Palace Attendant Rong looked up. Her face was pale, but her lips were so bloody they seemed to drip blood. "You think you can defeat me like this?" There was no pain in her voice at all, only coldness. Chapter 388. From the start of the real battle, Palace Attendant Rong could not see Ding Ning at all, yet she still did not feel she would lose. She only needed to find Ding Ning and appear in front of him. Then Ding Ning would die. She could withstand many more flying swords like this. But Ding Ning could not withstand one of her attacks. She looked up and started to speak towards the alley on the left. Many people under the black umbrellas shouted in shock and anger. Those black umbrellas flew up like black lotuses, landing in the dense crowd of people in the alley. Palace Attendant Rong's life bond sword disappeared from her hand, but as she spoke each word, her breath carried a true life bond sword energy. It was still a cold sword energy that flashed with a porcelain sheen. Streaks of sword chi flew towards the alley that her gaze was locked on and landed on it. The straight sword energies were originally small, but when they landed from the sky, They attracted primal energies of the universe and formed even smaller sword energies. These sword chis fell on the streets and alleys, and nothing could escape. The roof tiles were cut, the walls were cut, and some dogs and cats that had just sensed danger were cut into pieces. The sword energies did not stop after landing on the ground. They cut deep into the ground and created white waves of energy. Terrified screams accompanied the angry shouts of the cultivators under the black umbrellas. Waves of air flew out from the surface of the black umbrella, trying their best to protect the panicking commoners. The white waves of energy were still charging upwards. Palace attendant Rong's figure appeared in the white waves. She stood on top of the ruins, standing in the midst of the panicked crowd. Her figure appeared exceptionally cold and powerful. Yet the confidence in her eyes had disappeared. How is this possible? She cried out involuntarily. Many cultivators felt the same as her. Some cultivators who did not know each other, but felt the other's cultivation were similar, could not help but look at each other, wanting to see the answer in each other's eyes. When the flying sword had used so many astounding secret swords, they finally sensed the presence of the imperial envoy from the chaotic energy. They also believed that Ding Ning was in that area. Even if Ding Ning could travel underground, he could not hide his tracks under Palace Attendant Rong's sword. However, Ding Ning was not there. Where was Ding Ning? Then, to the bewilderment and shock of these cultivators, they found that Ding Ning's flying sword had disappeared as well. Just now, Palace Attendant Rong's sword energy had landed. Their attention had been focused on the shattered residences, but a flying sword just now had suddenly escaped the perception of so many people. This was almost impossible. However, Ding Ning did it. It was even hotter in the dusty ruins. Palace Attendant Rong's fingers grew colder. The flying sword also disappeared from her perception. The coldness spread from her fingertips to her entire body. This was clearly a duel of life and death, but Ding Ning had turned it into a game of hide-and-seek. She felt no fear, but she was furious. She finally decided to live one day for herself. She had risked everything to kill Ding Ning, but she feared she could not kill Ding Ning. As a result, her bright red lips finally started to bleed. She bit her lip and opened her mouth, wanting to curse out angrily. But in this moment, a cloud of dust behind her flew up. She turned, and her body naturally flew in the opposite direction of the cloud of dust. There was a soft sound. A wave of blood gushed out from her feet. What hit her feet was just a wave of white energy. This wave of white energy had been activated by her sword move just now and did not have any lingering presence of sword essence. It had no power. However, within this white chi, there was a silent flying sword without the slightest killing intent. The flying sword quickly pierced through her left foot, and then with a flash, disappeared into the crack under her body. The sword wound was not large, but it sinisterly cut through several important blood vessels under her feet. Blood spurted out crazily from her feet and even splattered in front of her. Palace Attendant Rong's face twisted in anger and pain, but she could not do anything. The flying sword had already disappeared from her perception. Hide-and-seek was a game that Changling's children liked to play. Yet at this time, looking at the blood on Palace Attendant Rong's body, no one felt that this was a game. Palace Attendant Rong used vital energy to stop the bleeding with just a thought. But in this moment, she had lost a lot of blood. This was a blow that could truly threaten her. Palace Attendant Rong landed on the ground. The moment she landed, the wound on her left foot stopped bleeding. There was a layer of bright porcelain light that sealed the wounds on both sides of his body. The ground under her feet seemed to boil. Waves of powerful vital energy surged out of her fingertips. They did not fall to the ground, but charged into the sky above her head. However, the wind brought about by the wind brought all the air on the ground up, causing countless grains of sand on the ground to fly up. A sandstorm formed from the ground upwards. Each grain of sand increased in volume and grew brighter and sharper as the sandstorm blew and the grains of sand rubbed against each other. Everyone in the surrounding streets felt the heat recede, but they found it harder to breathe. All the hot air and air were drawn into the sandstorm that Palace Attendant Rong had created. There was a loud boom. The sandstorm turned red. Burning. Explosion. The scorching hot airflow carried countless sharp red sand grains, exploding outwards in all directions. Previously, when Ding Ning had used a secret sword, it had been like a rising sun, but that was just light. However, this explosion contained a huge and real power. It was like a red sun was exploding. So even from a distance, one could see the ball of fire spreading and feel the powerful energy vibrations. This was a power that even Realm 7 cultivators might not be able to display. Most Realm 7s would not use their vital energy so recklessly. Such a great disturbance? Dressed in black robes, Su Fanqin immediately sensed the energy vibrations. He raised an eyebrow and said in surprise. On the river, Bai Shanxue was still looking at him patiently. He and Bai Shanxue had encountered each other for a long time. The bamboo hat on his head had shattered into countless threads a few minutes ago, but these threads were still floating above his head. For him and Bai Shanxue, time seemed to have stopped in this space. There was a rumbling sound. Thunder roared in the sky. But unlike the clear sky and dry thunder from before, dark clouds appeared in the sky above Chongling with this roar of thunder. A moist presence floated over from the distance. Bai Shanxue suddenly smiled at him. A wave of water vapor floated up from the river behind her. Su Fanqin's heart suddenly jumped. He suddenly understood that Bai Shanxue was not attacking because she was waiting for a weakness, but for a chance like this. Waiting for a weakness and waiting for a chance to attack were completely different for people like him and Bai Shanxue. The former meant that she was wary of his power, and the latter was waiting for a chance to kill him. His confidence suddenly disappeared like Palace attendant Rong when she could not find Ding Ning's figure in the sand. With a loud shout, the countless bamboo strands floating above his head brought out countless streams of air and flew outwards, instantly interweaving into a large talisman. The black long sword spinning around his body started to spin furiously. The black sword light completely wrapped around his body and turned into a black top. It was different from Palace attendant Rong, who was in a hurry to kill Ding Ning. This was Chongling. If he was not killed by Bai Shanxue in a short time, the one to die would be Bai Shanxue. It rained around the hanging pot hall. As the rain fell, the figure of a white-robed woman appeared in the black umbrella. This white-clothed woman looked like a very delicate young girl. But when most cultivators saw this figure, they naturally felt a strong sense of reverence. The rain with powerful Realm 7 presence fell from the sky and landed in the streets. It protected the terrified ordinary people and some weak cultivation students, but did not stop the explosion of energy and sand from spreading. It just formed a large net outside the battlefield. Fiery red energy and sand danced in the air. A residence on the right collapsed first, revealing Ding Ning's figure. Chapter 389. A thread of blood seeped out of Jing Liuli's lips. Jing Liuli bit her lip, but she did not detect it. She was very nervous. When she had presided over the Min Mountain Sword Trials, those students, including Ding Ning, had been in danger, but she had not felt any nervousness. But now it was different. This was a true battle of life and death. Both sides only had the goal of killing the other. No one would interfere. Also, corresponding to Ding Ning and Palace attendant Rong's cultivation, if Ding Ning was exposed to Palace attendant Rong's sight and perception, it meant death. Playing hide and seek with me? Palace attendant Rong's vital energy was greatly expended. Some of the wounds on her body started to bleed again, but a crazy smile appeared on her face. You cannot hide now, right? She was an old person of Chongling, and one of the people closest to the Bazinkindo ground back then. She would only think of it when she saw it, and learn it when she thought of it. Many of the strongest cultivators of Chongling in the future were usually the people closest to the top experts of the Bazinkindo ground back then. So the sword manual that Palace attendant Rong cultivated was extraordinary, and a secret sword that ordinary cultivation places could not imagine. But as the crazy smile spread across her face, waves of crazy sword essences came out of her mouth with powerful life bond presence. Ding Ning started to cough blood. Dust was still swirling around him. Palace attendant Roang's sword essences had not truly landed, but the energy pressure was almost unbearable. His feet touched the ground and uncontrollably slid backwards. The soles of his feet seemed to be burning. The cold murderousness in the air was so strong that even some Realm 7 experts in the crowd, who were stronger than Palace attendant Roang, were shocked. So a person's murderousness could be so strong and powerful. This was the sword essence of the Heaven Hatred Sword Manual. The emotions accumulated over many years with the strongest hatred created unimaginable murderousness. Streaks of sword chi, shining with porcelain sword light, fell on Ding Ning's body. The air in front of these sword chis turned black. The rubble around Ding Ning kept exploding, turning into fine powder. Then, they were pressed together by the powerful impact, forming some terrifying black strips. This was the difference in absolute power. It was impossible for Ding Ning to block such a sword strike. Even Jing Lioli felt that Ding Ning would not be able to block such a strike. Everyone felt that Ding Ning could not stop Palace attendant Roang's attack, just like how everyone felt from the start of the battle that a Realm 5 could not win against a Realm 6. However, everyone hoped to see a miracle. Then, Ding Ning made everyone see a miracle. He was already coughing up blood, but his expression remained calm. A presence in his body, under the pressure of a powerful force, entered the metal box behind him with difficulty but accuracy. The surface of the metal box was already covered in scorch marks after being burned by the fiery red smoke and scalding sand. However, at this moment, these scorch marks suddenly turned black, so black that it was as if there was ink flowing out from them. The metal box gave off a faint and distant presence. The moment this presence came out, Ding Ning stopped coughing blood and his breathing calmed. The powerful pressure from the sword chi had all disappeared. Many pure, white rays of light came out of the cracks in the metal box without any impurities. Even the sword chi showed signs of stopping. It was as if a white scroll had suddenly unfurled in the world around Ding Ning, imprisoning everything within. Everyone was shocked speechless. Even Huang Jinwei on the closest turret widened his eyes in shock. He did not understand what the metal box behind Ding Ning was that had such a powerful presence. Palace attendant Roang's breathing stopped, not because of shock, but because the air in front of her had almost frozen. Under everyone's disbelieving gazes, the ink on the surface of the metal box faded. An ink scroll flew out of the metal box behind him. There was a rumbling sound. There was a muffled thunder in the sky. The entire sky turned into the color of an ink painting, black and white. Palace attendant Roang's body shook violently, and blood seeped out of her ears. A sword light appeared in the black and white sky like a bolt of lightning. This was Ding Ning's flying sword that had been hidden somewhere. A heavy rain fell. Countless lines of rain with sharp sword essence fell, creating splashes several feet away from Palace attendant Roang. They were unable to cause true damage to her, but caused her sword energy to almost stop in the air. The burning sun in the sky was covered by black clouds. A white crescent moon formed. All the lines of rain started to freeze, turning the pure white lines into blue-black ice. All the spectators outside the arena felt a chill. The ice started to shatter, and then many cold and fiendish sword energies appeared. They danced and cut at Palace attendant Roang's sword energy. Palace attendant Roang's body started to tremble violently. The porcelain-like energy around her started to sway. Then she started to cough up blood. It is the remnant scroll of the Zhou family ink garden. Many people finally came to their senses and cried out in surprise. Jing Lioli finally recovered her breathing and felt some pain from her broken lips. The remnant scroll of the Zhou family ink garden was famous in Chongling, but no one had ever thought that a cultivator could use this to fight like this. Yet Ding Ning's miracle did not stop. He looked up. The flying sword in the sky was suddenly covered in blue-black ice and drew a long arc in the air. That arc was like all the missing parts of a crescent moon, filling the crescent moon perfectly. There was a loud boom. All of the energy around Palace attendant Roang started to explode. The remnant scroll that flew out of the metal box behind Ding Ning started to shatter, disintegrating along each ink line. There were no flames, but the fragments flew out along the seal essence as though they were burning. At the center of the explosion, Palace attendant Rome gave a shrill and terrifying howl. Blood sprayed out of her mouth. Her body was blown off the ground by an irresistible force and fell heavily to the ground. There was another explosion. A deep hole appeared in the ground like a meteor. From the center of the deep pit shot out streaks of terrifying dust and flames, which were mixed with scarlet chi and blood. The surrounding streets were deathly silent. Palace attendant Rome slowly stood up from the center of the hole. The porcelain-like light on her body had disappeared. Her skin was covered in shocking wounds. Her face was swollen, and blood seeped out of the corner of her lips. After pausing for a breath, she once again let out a shrill and furious howl. Not just because of the pain and wounds, but also because she had lost track of Ding Ning. The ashes of the ink garden remnant scroll were still floating in the air. The black ashes covered the entire sky like black snow, but the light reflected off them was like a piece of white paper. The cracks in space overlapped, making it impossible to see through them. Ding Ning was no longer there. Even the metal box behind him was no longer in the gravel. He did not take the chance to attack, but chose to disappear and play hide and seek with her. Just as Palace attendant Rome was seriously wounded and gave a shrill and furious howl, an old man with white hair and beard was slowly walking towards the tea garden. He was the Mo Shoching that Huang Jinwei had been worried about. Chongling had no walls, but he was one of the invisible walls of Chongling. Today, the streets were empty. All of their attention was focused on where Ding Ning and Palace attendant Rome were fighting. Then other places would naturally be unguarded, and unusual things would easily occur. He was a true wise person, and naturally had to prepare in advance. At this time, he had sensed the killing intent of the woman from Cloudwater Palace. He was no longer high up on the turret, and chose to be close to Bai Shan Shui. He did not want any more accidents, and did not want this woman to escape. The black sword light was still spinning like a top, and easily blew away all of the primal energies of the universe that landed on it. It was like hitting a real spinning top. No matter how strong the force was, it would only make the spinning top spin faster. This was an invulnerable defensive sword move. Realm 7 power could not break through. Yet looking at Su Fanqin's sword move, by Shan Shui, who knew that her battle with Su Fanqin would be detected by some of the top experts in Chongling, smiled brightly. In the sky, a glowing water droplet fell from the sky. When it was close to the ground, this glowing water droplet turned into a long river, a horizontal river. This long river was like a huge palm slapping down. The Blacktop's power had been created at the very bottom. As the force of the attack from above descended, the power of Su Fanqin's sword force pressed down. The two enormous forces instantly tore apart the ground below, and a huge hole was instantly drilled out. There was the sound of surging water deep below. Bai Shan Shui and Su Fanqin went down. Su Fanqin let out an angry roar, accompanied by Bai Shan Shui's wild and unruly laughter. Chapter 390. Mo Shoching's footsteps suddenly stopped. He was not far from Bai Shan Shui and Su Fanqin. At this time, he could clearly sense Bai Shan Shui and Su Fanqin's specific location. Yet he wanted to go closer, so he missed the chance to attack. He took a deep breath and let out a long sigh. Looking at the strands of white hair that had fallen off his forehead, and the dew that had formed on the hair due to the wetness, he thought that this short distance might be the will of the heavens. He was one of the oldest people in Chongling. He was familiar with the terrain and the shape of each building in Chongling. But he was not as familiar as Bai Shan Shui with the underground water system and the crisscrossing Yin rivers. Bai Shan Shui had risked her life to stay in Chongling for a long time to comprehend the lonely mountain sword horde. In the end, while she had not comprehended the true meaning of the lonely mountain sword horde, this inexplicable gain was her familiarity with the water system of Chongling. So today, she had thrown herself and Su Fanqin into the underground river. She used this to hide her location. She had successfully prevented Mo Shoching from capturing her figure. She had successfully played hide and seek with Mo Shoching. The water that fell to the ground quickly evaporated in the heat. White mist shrouded the streets where Ding Ning and palace attendant Rong were surrounded by people. Yi Sealing sensed the slight vibrations in the water in the deep wells in the streets. Her expression grew more complicated. Up until now, what Ding Ning had done was a miracle. His plan from the start had not been wrong at all. Palace attendant Rong screamed shrilly. Her eyes closed. Blood stretched out like threads and flew in all directions. She started to feel the true threat of death. Because she hadn't experienced a battle like this for many years, she hadn't suffered a single injury. Therefore, at this moment, whether it was her external injuries or internal injuries, they were magnified infinitely in her perception and consciousness. Only the amount of vital energy in her body was the most real and clear. Her vital energy had been greatly expended. Yet, she had no choice at this time. She had to find Ding Ning again. The greatest secret sword of Fong Ho Province. Ink Garden Remnant Scroll. What other tricks do you have? I don't believe that your methods are endless. Amidst the shrill cries, many people unconsciously began to tremble. Palace attendant Rong's life-bond sword strangely came out of her mouth. As she screamed, it charged high into the sky and immediately surpassed the limits of everyone's vision. Her natal sword flew to a height that no one could see, and it was still flying straight up. Palace attendant Rong looked up. Tears of blood started to flow from the corners of her eyes. At this moment, she was not worried about Ding Ning's sneak attack. She was only worried about whether or not there would be any sparks in the sky that would fly to stop them. She was worried about the decree of the noblest woman in the depths of the palace. Even her life-bond sword was exuding a strong, pleading intent. She only begged her master to grant her a fair fight. Beyond the boundless void that her perception could reach, there was a twinkle of starlight, as if someone had blinked. No sparks fell. Palace attendant Rong screamed even more shrilly, but there was joy in her voice. High up in the sky, a terrifying roar resounded. Everyone looked up at the sky and saw a black shadow falling down at an unimaginable speed. This was Palace attendant Rong's flying sword. At this time, it was faster than a true meteor. So when a meteor fell, it would only leave a long tail of smoke behind it. But when her life-bond sword fell, it would cause explosions at the tip of the sword. Visible shock waves overlapped in the air. Then this flying sword smashed to the ground in front of Palace attendant Rong. The ground started to shake like waves. The crowd panicked. But Yi Sealing, who was at the front, did not act this time. None of the surrounding buildings collapsed. All the power of this sword strangely charged towards one point. There was a loud boom. Among the densely packed shops, one of them suddenly disappeared, as if it had been smashed by an invisible giant fist. All the dust flew up into the sky, turning into a pillar of smoke that soared into the sky. There was a flash of metal in the pillar of smoke. The suppressed exclamations finally erupted at this moment, turning into a frenzy. That was Ding Ning's flying sword. This sword had not been able to hit Ding Ning directly. It had only caught Ding Ning's flying sword. But Palace attendant Rong, who was still in a joyful mood, was not disappointed. Her figure floated up and landed towards the enormous pillar of smoke. She reached out to grab the last flower remnant sword. No swordsman below Realm 6 could withstand such power when it hit the flying sword. When a flying sword was hit so heavily by a controller, the controller would naturally be seriously injured. For Palace attendant Rong, if she could defeat this flying sword and stop Ding Ning from using it, Ding Ning would undoubtedly lose this battle. She did not even need to hurry to find Ding Ning, who was playing hide and seek with her. She just needed to rest and recover her vital energy. Amidst the wild gasps, the last flower remnant sword that had charged up with the dust landed in her hand. This remnant sword was covered in dust, its light dim. It could not resist at all. Jing Liuli looked up at this scene. Even she felt that palace attendant Rong, who was flying next to the enormous pillar of smoke, was like a demon. Her expression became extremely ugly. The sword was the life of a swordsman. She could not imagine how Ding Ning could win this battle when the last flower remnant sword was in Palace Attendant Rong's hands. At this time, the enormous pillar of smoke suddenly split apart. In the summer, a white stream of snow cut apart the enormous pillar of smoke. Ding Ning appeared again. He appeared at the other end of the pillar of smoke that had been cut apart. He held a long sword in his hand. The original color of the sword could not be seen because it was covered in thick snow. Snow reflection sword. On the turret, Huang Jinwei stilled and instinctively shouted the name of this sword. Jing Lioli was also stunned. This was her sword. It was also one of the strongest swords of Min Mountain Sword Sect. Ever since she started learning from Ding Ning, this sword had been kept by Ding Ning. She could imagine Ding Ning using this sword, but she could not imagine the sword essence Ding Ning was using right now. She did not know what kind of secret sword Ding Ning's sword was. But the power of this sword, the cold presence, was above the cold mountain thousand snow that she could only use when she used the vital energy of cold mountain snow with this sword. Palace Attendant Rong straightened her body slightly. She did not think at all and just swung the last flower remnant sword in her hand. The sword threads at the front of the last flower remnant sword split apart and immediately gave off shrill sword howls, just as shrill as her cries just now. The snow stream surging towards her immediately collapsed. As the snow and ice flew, Ding Ning's body seemed to shake like he had been struck by lightning. He flew backwards and spat out mouthfuls of blood. Amidst the gasps, the madness in Palace Attendant Rong's eyes seemed to burn completely. She took a step forward. Her body crossed dozens of feet in the air and chased after Ding Ning's flying body. "Is this all you have? Are there any other moves?" Her left foot that had been stabbed by Ding Ning started to bleed rapidly again. Many of the wounds on her body started to bleed, but she did not care. In her view, everything was about to end. On the nearby turret, Huang Jinwei's robes vibrated softly. He was hesitating whether to act or not. Palace Attendant Rong's last flower remnant sword swept towards Ding Ning's neck. Now, she knew why she hated Ding Ning so much. She would only be satisfied when she saw Ding Ning's head fly. Ding Ning made her hate everything, even herself. More gasps sounded. Ding Ning was so seriously injured that he might not even be able to use his vital energy well. How could he block Palace Attendant Rong's blow? Also, Palace Attendant Rong was close to him. But at this time, Palace Attendant Rong sensed an unusual presence. She unconsciously looked at her right hand. Chapter 391. Her right hand was the hand with which she held the sword. The sword she held was Ding Ning's last flower remnant sword. That unusual presence seemed to first come from Ding Ning's body, and then like a spark igniting a pot of hot oil, it ignited a certain presence inside the last flower remnant sword. She did not have time to ponder why this was happening, or what consequences this unusual presence would bring. She just felt danger. A sense of danger that was even stronger than when a flying sword pierced her foot caused her heart to violently contract. At the same time, the true essence in her body had already gathered in the palm of her right hand with a loud rumble. Then, it drew in the surrounding heaven and earth yuan qi, bursting forth with a terrifying power. The last flower remnant sword suddenly lit up. Theoretically, Ding Ning should have lost control of this small remnant sword. But what caused many gasps to stop was that countless fine white flowers bloomed on the remnant sword. The dense white flowers bloomed at a terrifying speed, almost covering the entire sword. It was more stunning than when Ding Ning had used it. A heart-shaking sword essence burst out of the last flower remnant sword as Palace Attendant Rong's right hand released terrifying power. It was like a controlling sword essence. Or it could be said that at this moment, the intuition of all the powerhouses watching the battle should be the Imperial Sword Will. But the surface of the last flower remnant sword was not modeled. This sword essence came from the deepest part of each sword thread, like it was the sword itself, the soul of the sword. With a boom, the two bursting powers collided between Palace Attendant Rong's fingers and palms, and then a great explosion occurred. Etienne, an uncontrollable gasp sounded. This voice was old, but the owner was a Realm 7 expert, an old man who lived in seclusion in a cultivation place. So with just 2 words, there was an ocean of primal energies of the universe rampaging in the sky like 2 muffled claps of thunder. In this moment, this old man from Chongling and the surrounding cultivators who had experienced those years realized at the same time. They realized at the same time the power coming out of the last flower remnant sword was a sword essence caused by the controlling sword essence. This sword essence came from the last flower remnant sword itself. It came from the master of the last flower remnant sword. The method of controlling sword essence was originally just a method of forming seals to simulate the sword essence of a powerful swordsman. But the sword essence Ding Ning activated now came from the sword itself, and even carried the presence of the master's last battle. It was as if this sword had burned its own soul in the end. In the great explosion, Palace Attendant Rong's body suddenly shook. Her face was as white as snow. Her right palm turned into a bloody mist. She suppressed the power of the last flower remnant sword and the sword essence of the stubborn Bazin Kendo, ground woman. However, her hand was not as strong as the last flower remnant sword. Her flesh and bones could not withstand such an attack. An extremely cold aura pierced through the bloody mist that had exploded from her palm and pierced towards her body with a biting cold, killing intent. How is this possible? An official of the Astrology Bureau under the Black Umbrella was so shocked that he couldn't help but cry out. In the presence of Yi Sealing, it was a very serious matter for an official like him to lose control of his emotions and exclaim. Yet no one noticed at this time. Even Yi Sealing did not notice. Just like all these cultivators, she still had the afterimage of the previous scene in her eyes. But in her perception, she could sense Ding Ning's sword approaching Palace Attendant Rong's body. No one could understand how Ding Ning was able to control the vibrating vital energy in his body and attack like this. Palace Attendant Rong could not understand either. The true essence in her body was also extremely chaotic at this time, but she still had her left hand, so she had not sensed the arrival of death. She still believed that her left hand was enough to deal with Ding Ning's attack and kill Ding Ning. Her left hand stabbed straight forward. All the chaotic, vital energy and primal energies of the universe in her left hand were forced out of her fingertips. Ding Ning took a deep breath. The snow mirror sword in his hand collided with the power Palace Attendant Rong had forced out without any finesse. In this moment, his face paled. With a puff, he spat out a mouthful of bloody mist. But the snow mirror sword in his hand did not retreat at all and flicked upwards. This was the secret sword of White Goat Cave. White Goat Hanging Horn. Palace Attendant Rong took a deep breath. She only needed a breath to adjust the vital energy in her body. She only needed a breath to kill Ding Ning. Yet at this time, she suddenly felt pain in her energy sea. She looked down in shock. A hole appeared in her abdomen where her energy sea was. A hole that went from front to back. Her body started to tremble, but her mind was still blank. She did not even dare to believe this was real. But what was real was that the cultivation she had worked hard to accumulate for many years seemed to have disappeared like this and charged out of her body through this hole. All the feeling of power faded from her body. Her body was pushed back by the vital energy and energy that had charged out of her body and flew into the air. In the surrounding streets, all the spectators were shocked and bewildered. That was a sword light. It was the last flower remnant sword that had fallen powerlessly. Yet in that moment, the last flower remnant sword flew up, piercing through Palace Attendant Rong's energy sea and flying into the air behind her. No one understood how Ding Ning was able to forcibly control his vital energy when he was seriously injured. No one understood how Ding Ning was able to use the White Goat Hanging Horn against a power much stronger than him and the last flower remnant sword that had fallen to the ground. No one could understand. This was a miracle. A Realm 5 challenging a Realm 6 was a miracle in itself. All the cultivators witnessed this miracle. Boom! Boom! 2 consecutive heavy thuds could be heard. Ding Ning and Palace Attendant Rong fell to the ground. Dust flew into the air. Ding Ning sat up with difficulty from the dust. His body was covered in blood and dust. He appeared wretched, but he had a smile on his face. The last flower remnant sword flashed with cold light and moved forward with great difficulty in the air. Like a dragonfly with one wing missing, it swayed and fell. But it was falling towards where Palace Attendant Roan had fallen. Palace Attendant Roan lay in the dust, unable to get up. Blood flowed out of her wounds of various sizes like red earthworms crawling through the dust. The surrounding streets were deathly silent. The entire world seemed to be silent. Everyone looked at the flying sword that fell crookedly towards Palace Attendant Roan and knew the result of this battle would not change. After Palace Attendant Roan fell to the ground, she used all her strength to flip over. She looked up at the sky, her eyes slightly dilated and dazed as though she did not find the sunlight blinding. All of her emotions seemed to have flowed out of her body, along with the blood flowing out of her. She felt her body was very empty. She did not see the flying sword that was falling towards her. She just felt everything was empty. She suddenly felt it was laughable. So after being in Chongling for so long and doing so many things, everything was empty. In the end, she had nothing. There was a soft hiss. The last flower remnant sword fell into her heart. Her body did not move. It was as though the body that the sword pierced had nothing to do with her. All the spectators shook. The sword seemed to be piercing through their bodies. Everything seemed to be still at this moment. Only Ding Ning was smiling. Everyone could feel his joy. For some unknown reason, perhaps because the sword essence of the white goat hanging horn was still there, everyone inexplicably thought of Shui Wangshu of White Goat Cave and the old man who had died before the Min Mountain sword trials. In reality, many people present hoped that Ding Ning would win, and that Palace Attendant Roan would die. But now that it had come true, they did not feel any joy from Ding Ning and Palace Attendant Roan's expressions. At this time, the sky suddenly darkened. No clouds covered the sun, but the sky suddenly darkened. Ding Ning's hand started to tremble slightly. This was a presence he was very familiar with. He knew who had come. Chapter 392. There were no clouds covering the sun, but the sky suddenly darkened because many wondrous rays of light and energy had blocked the sunlight. These rays of light were wondrous, and enough to cause most cultivators present to tremble from the bottom of their hearts. Because in their cultivation process, they had never touched the energy contained in these rays of light. Or rather, they would never touch the energy in these rays of light in their entire lives. Because these rays of light came from high up in the sky and usually did not fall to the ground. The moment they reacted, these powerful cultivators bowed their heads in fear. As though bowing their heads was not enough to express their awe, their bodies also bowed slightly. The cultivators in these streets seemed to be much shorter than usual. As to the people of Chongling who were not even cultivators, they almost knelt on the ground in shock when they saw the perfect woman who had appeared with the wondrous starlight and caused the sky to darken. No one spoke at this time, but everyone knew that this seemingly otherworldly woman was the mistress of Chongling and the entire Qin dynasty, the Empress. Huang Jinwei also looked in shock at this perfect woman who covered all the light in the world and seemed to gather all the color in the world on her body. He had not expected the Empress to leave the palace and appear here. Ding Ning did not look up. He coughed up blood and sensed that familiar presence. While he forced his hands to tremble, his body seemed to be trembling all over. He found that while he hated this woman who came from Jiaodong Commandery and changed the situation of Chongling and the Qin dynasty, when he truly faced this woman, it was still difficult and unbearable. He did not know if it was because he was unwilling to look or because he did not dare to look. From beginning to end, he did not look up at her. The starlight covered the sun. The Empress of the Qin dynasty had arrived. The last thread of blood in Palace Attendant Roan's heart was flowing down the broken sword into the dust below. Palace Attendant Roan had not seen the flying sword that had stabbed towards her heart, but at this time, she clearly saw this perfect woman who seemed to cover the entire sky in front of her. Previously, she had felt the city was empty, and everything was empty. She only felt this was laughable, and did not even feel pain. However, at the end of her life, The instant she saw this perfect woman, her body began to convulse. She felt immense pain. She began to understand that her entire life had been shrouded in this woman's shadow. In other people's eyes, and even in her own eyes, all of her power and influence came from this woman, and her power and influence were shocking enough. However, before she died, she realized that this woman was too perfect and powerful. When she met her, she was no longer herself. She was just scared. She had always been afraid of her. The Empress walked up to her, looking at Palace Attendant Rong, who was convulsing and bleeding tears, her brow slowly furrowed. An incomprehensible expression appeared on her porcelain-like face. Why? She looked at Palace Attendant Rong, who was in the final throes of pain. With a hint of anger and indescribable pain, she asked softly, I said that if you do not leave the palace, I can ensure your safety. Why did you leave the palace? Palace Attendant Rong looked at the Empress. She should have died by now. Yet, she found that she was not dead. She still had the strength to speak. A fresh presence flowed out of the Empress' sleeve into her body, replacing the last of her blood as it flowed into her body. This presence was immortal, otherworldly, and not of the mortal world. Yet this presence was too familiar to Palace Attendant Rong, so familiar that the lotus pond appeared in her mind. The Empress would spend a lot of time each day standing in front of the spirit lotus pond. In the eyes of other people, this presence was a pure and holy white energy. Ding Ning did not look up, but he clearly sensed this presence. He sensed that Palace Attendant Rong, who should have died, was hanging on to her last breath. His body immediately froze. The dead could not speak and would hide many secrets. But Palace Attendant Rong was not dead yet. If she spoke of a secret, he and many people in Chongling would die or suffer a fate worse than death. There were countless words in Palace Attendant Rong's mind. The medicinal power of the spirit lotus could not save her from death, but it made her mind clearer than ever. She thought of the last few moments when Ding Ning had fought her. She started to understand why Ding Ning had been able to kill her so easily. So this was the reason. It was not just because of Shui Wangshu, but also because of that person and many people from the Bazenkendo ground who had died because of her. She had a chance, enough time to speak. Yet, when she heard the voice of the perfect woman who covered her, filled with regret, she did not speak in such a precious time. She used a lot of time to think of many beautiful scenes. She thought about how before she followed this perfect woman, she thought about how she admired those people's swords and battles. She thought about how she met that team master, and how she and that team master had imprisoned each other, as if they would be imprisoned like this for the rest of their lives. Yet these scenes disappeared in the end. In the end, everything was gone. Tears of blood came out of the corners of her eyes again. She looked at her perfect mistress. The other's last words seemed to ring in her ears. Why did you leave the palace? Because I still can't be as cold as you. She smiled miserably, tears of blood flowing down her face. She used the last of her strength to say these words. The Empress' breathing suddenly stopped. She was truly stunned. She had not expected Palace Attendant Rong to say such a thing in the end. So much so that her body felt a little cold at this moment and a little stiff. But this emotion only appeared for a moment. In the next moment, her brow furrowed slightly. All of the anger and regret in her eyes disappeared into indifference, or rather, into a gaze that was as high as a god. She controlled the world without any emotion of her own. There were no traces of age or blemishes on her perfect face. Her somewhat indifferent gaze fell on Ding Ning, who was coughing blood with his head down. Then she said emotionlessly, I thought you would stay your hand, at least for my good intentions. There was no preamble to her words, and she did not lower her volume. All the cultivators present heard her clearly. No one felt that she was being too domineering. They only felt that it was normal for her to say such a thing given her status. It was a matter of course. Some people even started to recall the good intention she had shown to Ding Ning and Ding Ning's responses. They even unconsciously started to feel that if Ding Ning did not give a reason, they would feel that Ding Ning had gone too far in this matter. Especially at this time, when this extremely noble empress personally said these words to Ding Ning. To their surprise, Ding Ning just coughed blood and said softly, "I am very sorry." But these 3 words caused many people to feel like a cold wind had blown through their hearts. After Ding Ning said these 3 words, he did not say anything else. The empress turned around. She did not say anything else. The sky gradually brightened. The falling starlight started to disappear. She disappeared into the disappearing starlight. Ding Ning still did not look up. This was his first reunion with the empress. Chapter 393. Some of the Chongling cultivators present sensed the empress' departing figure and were silent. They could not know Ding Ning's feelings. To them, Ding Ning had once again rejected the empress' good intentions. This youth from the falling parasol wine shop had his head bowed, but he had never lowered it. Everyone's gaze gathered on Ding Ning again. Looking at this youth who was sitting in a pool of blood and coughing up blood as he breathed, many people started to worry that his injuries would be so serious that it would permanently affect his future cultivation. In the world of cultivators, when vital energy was rampaging in the body, forcefully using vital energy was akin to disregarding one's meridians and passing through one's vital energy. Hurried footsteps sounded. Multiple doctors quickly walked out of the clinic. When the leading doctor helped Ding Ning up, he shoved a pill into Ding Ning's mouth and started to treat him. Do not let anyone enter the clinic to avoid interfering with the treatment. The owner of the clinic, Sun Xingtong, said to Jing Liuli and the others at the door with a serious expression. Seeing this scene, everyone in the surrounding streets started to realize why the Guanzhong Xie family had reserved this clinic from the start. Jing Liuli nodded. She glanced at Ding Ning, who was passing by, and then sat down without any style on the doorstep of the clinic. She thought with her head bowed and felt happy for Ding Ning. Most of the people in the streets only saw Ding Ning's moment of revenge and the joy of Ding Ning's victory. But not many people could see what Ding Ning had paid for this and feel the pain Ding Ning had suffered. Yet at the same time, she felt that something was wrong about the entire matter. Not because Ding Ning had been able to inexplicably use that flying sword in the end, but because there was something important that was wrong. She bowed her head and did not care about other people's gazes. She thought as though no one was around, and her frown deepened. The empress returned to the Phoenix carriage. Her Phoenix carriage stopped at the center of Chongling's Central Avenue. Tassels made of pure gold covered her figure. She sat on the Phoenix throne at the center of the chariot, anger once again appearing in her cold eyes. She knew that Bai Shanshui and Su Fanqin were fighting. At this point, the battle was still not over. It could only be said that Qin Shui's strength had far exceeded her expectations. It meant that she would lose more than just this palace made today. The underground water vein was an unknown world. Because it was unknown, most of the books referred to the underground water veins as the Underworld River and the Yin River. It wasn't just because it didn't see the sun all year round. It was also because it was cold and heavy. It wasn't just the depth, but also the weight of the earth and a lot of vital energy. All of this made the Yin River flow underground extremely heavy, crushing down on the bodies of the cultivators. It was completely different from fighting on the surface. What terrified Su Fanqin was in this underground Yin River. There was only him and Bai Shanshui. No one else would interfere. Previously, his battle with Bai Shanshui had only allowed him and Bai Shanshui to enter deeper into the Yin River. The increasingly strong Yin and cold water caused the black longsword swimming around him to feel greater pressure. He felt everything was slowing down, and his defense would have problems at any time. Since defense was useless, he could only counterattack. The black sword light that had been spinning around him left his side, passing through the black, crystal-like water flow, and slowly and steadily fell towards Bai Shanshui's body. In the darkness without any light, Bai Shanshui's body could not be seen clearly. But there was a ball of green water deeper than the darkness rippling around Bai Shanshui's body, giving off true murderousness. Streaks of green sword energy moved against the flow of the Yin River without any obstruction and stabbed towards Su Fanqin. While Su Fanqin's black sword was moving through the water, his body was already inexplicably covered with more than 10 wounds. Some of the wounds were so deep that his bones could be seen. The blood that flowed out from these wounds melted into the black water, as if several red ribbons had appeared on his body out of nowhere. Compared to the green water flow around by Shan Shui, Su Fanqin's sword appeared very small. It was like a small black fish hook against an enormous blue whale. But Su Fanqin's expression did not change much. His sword was called the whale fishing sword. When the black sword came into contact with the huge ball of green light, the entire ball of green light was held back by the sword force of his sword, and no sword light could flow out. Countless rays of light came out of Su Fanqin's body. This was the primal energies of the universe in his body burning. The burning primordial chi produced dazzling lines that resembled the broken strings of a zither. His entire body was like a burning zither. This was when he was most terrifying. Only a few people knew that the reason he had the name Su Fanqin was because the vital energy method he cultivated was called the burning zither scripture. The most terrifying aspect of this method was that one could obtain greater power by burning large amounts of vital energy in an instant. Even if this power could only be maintained for a short time, it was enough to kill or escape. When the glowing water droplet turned into a horizontal river and slammed him into the underground river, he was certain that Bai Shan Shui's cultivation had grown completely. At this time, Bai Shan Shui was not the Bai Shan Shui who had been singing and fighting on the streets of Chongling. But Bai Shan Shui was not realmate. He was sure that as long as he escaped from the Yin River, he would be able to live a good life. He only needed a moment. He was certain that unless Bai Shan Shui was realmate, he could not defeat his whale fishing sword in this moment. All the energy beams that were like burning zither strings stabbed upwards, instantly evaporating all the water around him and bouncing his body up at an astounding speed. However, at this moment, his face turned abnormally pale. He sensed a new power emerging from the Yin River underground, a power that seemed to have formed inexplicably in the river, but was as strong as Bai Shan Shui. Also, this power formed like a storm, and was even more violent than Bai Shan Shui's power. He even felt a sense of familiarity. He realized where this power came from. Yi! He cried out in disbelief. Yet he was only able to say one word. His voice could not be heard in the underground Yin River. That power that came along the river seemed to merge perfectly with Bai Shan Shui's power. There was a cracking sound in his ears. A cracking sound was also heard from his body. The black sword was repelled and stabbed deeply into his body, almost cutting open his abdomen. His energies and shattered organs started to burn at the same time. More multicolored light gushed out from his body. There was a loud boom. An explosion occurred by a river bank in the outskirts of Chongling. A patch of reeds started to burn. A ball of light flew out of the ground into the air. The Phoenix carriage returned on the main road of Chongling. When this ray of light appeared in the sky, the Phoenix carriage suddenly sank. The thousands of golden threads covering the Phoenix chariot floated up together, making a sound that sounded like wind chimes. The perfect woman from Jiaodong Commandery looked up slightly in the direction of the ray of light. She knew what had happened, but her expression became colder than when she saw palace attendant Rong die, so cold that it did not change at all. Chapter 394. Jing Liuli was still thinking on the steps. She instinctively felt that she had missed something very simple, but she could not remember it. The light that shot into the sky by the river only appeared for a short moment. However, the powerful origin energy caused a gust of wind to blow. In the Tiger and Wolf Army's camp, many tents swayed slightly. Sitting cross-legged on the bamboo mat, Liang Lian suddenly opened his eyes. He was a Realm 7 expert and naturally sensed that this gust of wind came from unusual energy vibrations. Unlike other places in Chongling, when this gust of wind blew into the Tiger and Wolf Army's tents, there was a bone-chilling coldness. The moment Liang Lian opened his eyes, a layer of blue-black frost formed on his hair and eyebrows. A coldness that seemed to come from the deepest depths of the earth broke through the air and arrived in front of him. His expression changed dramatically. Without time to think, His hands slammed down on the desk in front of him. With a muffled boom, the desk shattered, and a dark gold round shield flew out from the wooden compartment. The runes on the shield were like bright red roses, and instantly attracted the chi of heaven and earth to move like a mountain. The entire central tent collapsed like a deflated balloon. In the next moment, with a fierce explosion, the entire tent turned into countless pieces of leather that stabbed outwards like swords. An extremely deep blue and black sword light flew out of nowhere, as though breaking through space. It passed through the entire northern tiger wolf army and headed straight for the center of the main tent, where Liang Lian's entire body seemed to swell outwards. Countless loud shouts rang out. Sword lights danced in the air, and at least dozens of flying swords met the sword light with a resolute aura. Crack, crack, crack. The sound of ice forming could be heard. In the path of this deep blue-black sword radiance, not only were several flying swords directly covered in dark black ice crystals, falling to the ground, even several cultivators were directly frozen where they were, turning into ice sculptures without any signs of life. What frightened the swordsmen the most was that even now, they were unable to determine where the controller of this sword light was. Liang Lian's expression was cold, as if he was wearing a black iron mask. His heart violently contracted. He knew who the owner of this sword light was, and he knew that he was no match for him. Southeast 347. He shouted out the woman's location, and at the same time, most of the true origin in his body surged into the bottom of his body. The blanket beneath his body had already been blown to pieces, revealing a silver-like flash. 6 silver, hexagonal metal pillars rose from the ground, protecting him in the center. Boom! The blue-black sword light that came from an unknown distance collided with the power released and gathered by the 6 metal pillars, creating a violent explosion. Boom! Almost at the same time, a loud noise that was hundreds of times louder than this one, seemingly occupying the entire space of the camp, rang out. All the chariots in the camp of the tiger and wolf army shone brightly. A sea of light formed in the camp. Then, there was the sound of countless enormous objects moving through the air. Dozens of white cloud-like airwaves exploded in midair. Dozens of spear-shaped artifacts as thick as a person's waist broke through the clouds and landed in the direction Liang Lian pointed out. That place was constantly expanding outwards, spreading out like demonic lotuses. At this time, it had already formed a world of snowstorms. Zhang Sun Qinxue was standing at the center of this snowstorm. All the soldiers and cultivators of the tiger and wolf army were furious. They knew that the cultivator in this snowstorm was extremely powerful and much stronger than the strongest cultivator in the camp, General Liang Lian. Otherwise, General Liang would not have activated his strongest defensive artifact, the 6 Gates Celestial Lock. Yet in the history of the Qin dynasty, there had never been a general of the Qin dynasty who had been assassinated in the main tent. In the armies of some dynasties that were enemies of the Qin dynasty, there might have been a general of 100,000 who had been assassinated by a Qin cultivator. But in the Qin dynasty, there had never been a general like this who had been assassinated in the main tent. Especially this kind of unscrupulous and direct assassination. Right now, any local army of the Qin dynasty had seal weapons that could kill 1 or 2 Realm 7 cultivators, much less the tiger and wolf army that protected Chongling. The elite troops of the Qin dynasty. When it was necessary, most of them wouldn't even blink an eye even if they had to use the flesh and blood of tens of thousands of soldiers to fill it up. Bravery. This was the most terrifying aspect of the Qin army in the eyes of the other dynasties. Zhang Sun Qinxue knew that even at that person's peak, he could not challenge an army like this alone. When that person died in battle in Chongling, all the cultivators in the world had a clear idea. A top cultivator in the world could at most kill 20 to 30 Realm 7s and 20,000 Qin soldiers. Also, in the last decade, the seal weapons of all the armies in the world had improved greatly and had greater power. Zhang Sun Qinxue felt the power of the dozens of enormous metal seal weapons piercing through the clouds. She had never seen them before. But now, all of this was due to someone's plan. She was just carrying out this person's plan. so she did not have to think at all. She looked up at the dozens of thick spears falling towards her, until the light of the metal caused the wind and snow around her to shine with a metallic luster. Until she saw the coiling dragon seal scripts on the enormous spears, she released all of her vital energy and accumulated energy, including the power of the life-bond sword in her energy sea. The wind and snow swept in front of her. The dozens of enormous spears were swept up by the wind and snow, and all of them fell back to the camp. The wind and snow filled the camp. The tents were overturned one after another. When they hit the ground, they produced a clear metallic sound. The originally flexible leather was actually forcefully snapped. The fury in the eyes of many cultivators turned to awe. They had heard some legends about that eldest Miss Gongsun, and knew that the sword was in her hands. Looking at the tents sealed in ice, they could not connect this power to the legendary eldest Miss Gongsun. Their line of sight was filled with blue-black light, and they had completely lost track of the woman. When they subconsciously turned around, wanting to hear the Grand General's next instructions, their breaths completely stopped. Dozens of enormous icicles seemed to stand chaotically in the center army. The coiling dragon seal scripts inside the icicles seemed to have grown to the outside of the icicles, and the blue-black ice stretched upwards like dragons. These icicles sealed off the entire center army. The wind and snow outside quickly weakened, but the wind and snow between the icicles grew thicker. The growing cold fiendish energy prevented even the Realm 5 and 6 cultivators in the army from getting close. Even their blood seemed to freeze. Zhang Sun Qinshua looked at the camp in the distance. Those enormous metal spears had inherited the sword essence of the sword in her body. The powerful energy of the sword was channeled into those enormous metal spears, enough to maintain this sword essence for a long time. She felt her strength. She was very satisfied. But after using up all the power in her body, she was now a powerless, ordinary person. She took a deep breath, turned, and started to walk towards a patch of trees behind her. There was a carriage parked in the forest. The person driving the carriage was very short, but even when he saw what Zhang Sun Qinshua had done, this person did not seem too shocked. He just asked in puzzlement, "Just this? Then who killed Liang Lian?" Zhang Sun Qinshua still had a cold expression. She seemed unwilling to answer, but out of respect for this person, she said impatiently, "That has nothing to do with me." Chapter 395. Liang Lian's body was as cold as iron. His eyebrows and hair were all frozen like needles. There was a thin layer of frost on his skin that gave off a blue-black light. The entire tiger and wolf army's main camp had become the true Nine Nether Hell. Liang Lian's gaze landed on his hands. Looking at the cracks on the skin of his hands, feeling the killing intent of the coldest sword energy in the world in his body, and feeling those internal injuries that suddenly became more serious, his expression was only one of indifference, but he felt puzzled in his heart. Sealing the camp was naturally to prevent his subordinates from entering this area. But this kind of cold had the same effect on any cultivator who entered. If eldest Miss Gongsun wanted to seek justice for the person she loved and hated back then, and did not want to see him leave Chongling and not have a chance to kill her in the future, then she would not be able to kill him. Then, after this eldest miss of the Gongsun family left, who could enter here to kill him in all of Chongling? Who among those people would stand on her side and enter here to kill him? Suddenly, his eyes narrowed slightly. The corners of his eyes cracked from the cold, but were immediately frozen by the cold energy, as though he had drawn a red eyeliner. A figure suddenly appeared in the blue-black wind and snow, carrying a box. The box was covered in blue-black ice crystals and appeared very large, like a coffin. This was a youth who should not have been here and should have been somewhere else. Military intelligence was usually the fastest to report back. Liang Lian did not leave the camp, but he knew the final result of the battle that had just ended. In the military report, this youth was seriously wounded. Liang Lian's eyes slowly widened, and the corners of his eyes cracked again. He seemed to find something amusing and could not help but laugh. Then he looked seriously at the youth and asked, "Nine-Death Silkworm?" This youth was Ding Ning. It seemed impossible for him to appear here, but he just had to appear in this kind of wind and snow. He was not coughing up blood. The surrounding wind and snow did not cause any tangible damage to him, but seemed to fill up some of the dry places in his body. Ding Ning looked a little pale. However, he was very calm, and his breathing was very smooth. Moreover, he was emitting an unprecedentedly powerful aura. At this time, he was sharper and stronger than when he had fought Palace Attendant Rome. At this moment, he was like a sword that had been completely unsheathed. You pretended to be seriously injured and then came to kill me. This way, no one will think it is you. Especially if I die in the hands of the Nine-Death Silkworm. In the hands of that person's heir, you will be even more innocent. Before Ding Ning spoke, Liang Lian shook his head and said softly as though he was mocking and praising, "In the future, no one will think that you are the heir to the Nine-Death Silkworm." Such a beautiful plan to kill several birds with one stone, as expected of that person's successor. Ding Ning looked at him calmly. Finally, his tightly pressed lips opened slightly and said, "No one would have thought that a cart driver back then would become General Liang today by selling out his friends for glory." Liang Lian said with cold disdain, "Does a cart driver have to be a cart driver?" Ding Ning shook his head and said, "Not necessarily. But to use such a method to become General Liang, you deserve to die. I really admire you." Liang Lian looked up and said sincerely, "Even the heir that person found is so powerful. If I die, who would think that the one who came to assassinate me is you? Who would think that you killed two great enemies in one day? But if you want to complete this plan, you must first be able to kill me. Right now, I am just a general who lacks military merit and has not been made a marquis." After a pause, Liang Lian laughed so hard that the blue-black ice on his face fell off. "I am a Realm 7 cultivator, and not a palace attendant." Ding Ning shook his head. Looking at this disdainful general, he sincerely corrected his words. "A seriously injured cultivator. The coldness is at its thickest, and then it will fade. This is the best time to attack. What are you waiting for?" Liang Lian put away his smile and looked at Ding Ning and the coffin-like box behind Ding Ning. "I'm also very curious. After using so many moves, what other moves do you have? Controlling Sword Essence? Controlling Miss Gongsuin's Sword Essence. And then when the snowstorm dissipates, can my army outside charge in?" General battles were not just about cultivation, but also mental attacks. But this was of no use to Ding Ning, since even Yi Siling, Bai Shan Shui, Zhang Sun Qin Xue, and many other stunning people were willing to become pawns in his plan. Then for him, he just had to act according to plan. When Liang Lian spoke, he knew that Liang Lian was about to attack. Then he accurately attacked before Liang Lian. The ice coffin-like iron box on his back opened an inch with a cracking sound. The last flower remnant sword flew out, the shadows on the blade dissipating. Liang Lian suddenly turned his head. In the wind and snow, a sword essence broke through the air behind him. He could not understand, but power unconsciously erupted from his hand. A muffled boom. His body swayed. With a splash, a black wave of water poured down, turning into countless ice beads that fell to the ground behind him. He slowly put away the simple long sword behind him. A thread of blood seeped out of the corner of his mouth and then froze on his face. Controlling Sword Essence. This is by Shan Shui's Sword Essence. Liang Lian looked at Ding Ning in the wind and snow ahead and slowly spoke. "Your timing is too good. Bai Shan Shui just used a sword, so this sword essence is very strong. What else do you have?" He wanted to see what else Ding Ning had, but he would not foolishly wait for Ding Ning to use all of his moves. His sword did not seem to move, but with a hiss, a corner of the wind and snow in the sky cracked. A terrifying presence gathered like a rod and smashed down like a heavenly punishment. This was the power of a Realm 7. Many explosions came from Ding Ning's body. Theoretically, he should not even be able to move right now. But at this time, countless silkworm sounds came from his body. Countless visible sparks of light surged out of his body, looking like countless real silkworms. Rustling sounds appeared in the air. The vital essence in Ding Ning's body flowed out steadily. The iron box behind him let out a shrill hiss, full of fear. Then the metal box opened several feet. A new snowstorm was formed as the black frost yuan qi in the iron box burst out with all its might. The countless silkworms covering Ding Ning's body opened their mouths at the same time and spat out the wind and snow that had been absorbed during his cultivation with Zhangsun Qinxue over the past decade. It was like all restraints had been undone. This was true impudence. Ding Ning's sword essence was also impudent. As the last flower remnant sword danced, all of this energy changed in the world dozens of feet in front of him, turning into a sword essence that Liang Lian could not understand and could not reach. All of his pride and confidence disappeared. He started to understand his mistake. He wanted to speak, but because of great terror, his voice trembled so much he could not make a sound. Ding Ning's sword had not finished. Hiss, 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 hiss. The cold, fiendish swords in his body all flew out. These small swords flew straight out, but did not return to one point and drew out straight paths. Every line was a unique talisman. The newly formed snowstorm belonged to these seal marks. Then all of the power changed and turned into a sword light. A sword light that Liang Lian had seen before. If he was not seriously injured and could use his Realm 7 power, he should have been able to receive this sword light. But at this time, he could clearly sense that his power was lacking by a thread. Just a thread, and it would be life and death. This sword was called One Thread of Heaven. Liang Lian's sword essence had completely erupted. The sword in his hand was still moving forward, but a line of blood had already appeared between his eyebrows. An expanding line of blood. Chapter 396. So you are not. Liang Lian looked fixedly at Ding Ning. Then a drop of blood came out of his brow, and he fell backwards. The moment he fell, his skin was covered in blue-black ice again. But this time, the ice and snow did not simply stay on the surface of his body, but seeped into his skin. When he fell to the ground, he had turned into a blue-black ice sculpture. This great general, who had gone through countless battles in his life and climbed out of piles of corpses many times without dying, finally died. He did not want to die, yet he died before leaving Chongling. No one heard the contents of his unfinished words, and no one knew what kind of secret was hidden in his last words. Ding Ning covered his mouth and nose with his hand. He was holding a thick cotton cloth in his hand. The moment the cotton cloth touched his lips and nose, he spat out a mouthful of blood. His breathing was uneven. Blood poured out of his mouth and nose, but he used the thick cloth to cover it all. The blood froze the cloth. Not even a drop of blood fell on the ground in front of him. His vision was blurry. Each breath he took felt like a small knife was scraping his chest, and the knife seemed to be covered in fine steel needles that went deep into his sternum. But he was very happy. He laughed as he vomited blood. By Shanshui's sword essence, Zhangsun Qinxue used all of her power and waited for so many years to finally kill you. Can you not die? He looked with unusual satisfaction at Liang Lian's corpse. Then he took another deep breath and started to run. He started to run towards the edge of the snowstorm. There was a pool there for horses to drink. At this time, the water in the pool had all disappeared. There was only a crack in the ground leading to the underground river. The carriage was sprinting towards the outskirts of Chongling. Zhangsun Qinxue closed her eyes slightly and leaned against the cushions of the carriage. In that short moment, she had already forced out all the power in her body, so she was no different from an ordinary person. But her cultivation was still there. Her perception was still stronger than most cultivators in Chongling. Suddenly, she opened her eyes and raised her head. Even though her vision was completely blocked by the roof of the carriage, her beautiful face that caused one's heart to tremble was still instantly filled with an expression of anger. A stream of flames appeared high up in the sky. A pale white star fell from the endless void. This has nothing to do with you. Zheng Xiu's sword strike is because of me, not you. However, at this time, the driver of the carriage turned his head and said softly to her. Then, The short coachman's body flew out from the front of the carriage, heading straight for a mountain to the side. The carriage continued to run along the road. Soon, another coachman came out from the forest beside the road and landed at the front of the carriage. The anger on Zhang Sun Qinchua's face had not disappeared, but when she sensed the direction of the starfire, she realized why Ding Ning wanted her to lose all of her vital energy and energy. After losing all her aura, the Empress who was returning to the palace could no longer sense her location. You understand her too well. However, the moment she came to her senses, the anger on her face became even more intense. At this time, the anger on her face appeared very pure, like a young girl who had not experienced the world. The short coachman had reached a mountain to the side. The mountain was not tall, but there were many trees. When the short driver began to reveal his true aura on the mountain, all the trees on the mountain began to turn red and then burst into flames. The short coachman looked up at the sky. The pale white star fire in the sky was visible to the naked eye as it fell towards the mountain. The flames of the trees were like the coachman's presence, giving off an unyielding and determined presence. The entire mountain had turned into a furnace. It was a blazing furnace that was hard to describe with words. All the flames left the burning trees. These trees were burning, the branches turning into black charcoal, and then quickly turning red, turning into white ash. However, all of the flames were pulled out, gathering at the peak of this mountain. Following the crazed fighting intent released by this carriage driver, it condensed into a flame sword, facing the pale white flame without any heat in the sky. With a boom, another bolt of thunder appeared in the sky. Previously, both the burning of the small mountain and the falling of the pale white starfire were too distant and small for Chongling. But when the thunder sounded in the sky, everyone in Chongling saw two enormous balls of fire explode in the sky above the countryside. One was pale white, spreading upwards like a holy white lotus. The other was fiery red, roiling like a furnace of molten iron. Looking at this red flame from a distance, many Chongling cultivators had ugly expressions. They knew that there was only one place where the cultivators could use such a sword essence. On the mountain top, the short coachman's hair danced in the wind. The light from the fire in the sky made her hair seem crimson red. The ground around her was covered in ashes, but there was an indescribable pride in her eyes. She gave people the feeling that she was a phoenix that had been reborn from the ashes. In Chongling, the Empress in the phoenix carriage did not look up even amidst the roar of thunder. But the coldness in her eyes deepened, like a thin layer of autumn frost had formed. Many years later, she started to feel true shock and anger again. Palace attendant Rong was dead. Su Fanqin was dead. In her perception, Liang Lian should have died in the snowstorm. These people who had always served her or had served her wholeheartedly had all died in one day. That Zhao Fourth of the Zhao Sword Furnace, who had once been defeated by her, had managed to stop her attack, but her shock and anger did not just lie in this. The eldest miss of the Gongsun family, by Shan Shui of Cloud Water Palace, and the Zhao Sword Furnace, her shock and anger was that these people seemed to have been pinched together by a pair of invisible hands. She felt a sense of familiarity, and that person still existed. She had been the one who had controlled Chongling all these years like the mandate of heaven. After the decision was made back then, that person was an unbearable memory for her. All the sweetness in the past had turned to humiliation after the decision was made that night. Now, palace attendant Rome was dead. That person was also dead. No one should know of that night. But did that middle-aged tea master know? Who had written that string of bone characters? Her body did not change at all, but the phoenix carriage started to tremble. High in the sky, many sparks flew chaotically. Amidst the thunder in the sky, Jing Lioli, who had been deep in thought outside the clinic, suddenly looked up. She saw the two balls of fire in the distant sky, and was so shocked her breathing stopped. She knew that something important was happening in the distance. In this moment, she seemed to have an epiphany. She understood what was wrong. She saw the change in the black ice worm. That black ice worm would definitely be a great help to Ding Ning. Yet in the battle with Palace Attendant Rome, she had not seen Ding Ning use the black ice worm. Based on her understanding of Ding Ning, it was absolutely impossible for Ding Ning to make a mistake and miss out on anything that could be used. Without any hesitation, before Yi Jingnan could react to the change in emotions on her face, her figure disappeared from the door of the courtyard. She entered the clinic and passed through 2 courtyards at her fastest speed until she reached the room with the thickest scent of medicine. Then, when the person inside shouted in shock and anger, her hand had already landed on the door of the room. The door of the room naturally opened. When she saw the situation inside, she stilled. There were bloodstains all over the bed in the room. Ding Ning was unconscious. A doctor looked angrily at her, his eyes almost spitting fire. Jing Liuli was silent for a breath. Then she nodded apologetically and left the door, closing it behind her. Chapter 397. When all the trees on the burning hill turned to ash, Zhao Xi's figure disappeared from the top of the hill. The pale white sparks flying in the sky had all disappeared without a trace. However, the red flames produced by the burning of these trees were still floating in the air, like an oven that was growing bigger and bigger. The starfire of the Empress and Zhao Xi's sword came from the eternal stars in the endless void, but it lost to the fire of the trees of this world. Because in this world, the fire of the mixed wood had ignited his entire life in an instant. In Northern Tiger Wolf Army's main camp, before all of the ice and snow on the enormous icicles faded, there were finally some cultivators who didn't care about the damage the cold energy that seemed to come from the underworld brought to them, charging into the main camp. Then they saw General Liang turn to an ice sculpture on the ground. In the blue-black ice, the red line at Liang Lian's brow was unusually shocking. In their perception, it rippled with soul-shaking sword essence. In this moment, these experienced cultivators could not control themselves. In their shock and anger, they could not speak. In the alley outside the medical clinic where Ding Ning and Palace Attendant Rong were fighting, the crowd had retreated. The surroundings were silent. Jing Liuli walked out of the door under Yi Jingnan and Su Heshan's puzzled gazes. For some reason, she felt even more admiration for Ding Ning. But her legs were heavy as though filled with lead. The presences in the sky were slightly chaotic. Moreover, because so many experts had completely released their auras, even the sky had darkened. There were clearly no dark clouds, but it was as if there were dark clouds covering the sun. Some drops of rain fell on the ground in front of Jing Liuli. The rain carried a hint of nether coldness, as though it had melted the ice and snow from the Tiger and Wolf Army's camp. At this time, Jing Liuli suddenly looked up. The crowd in front had already dispersed, and a young man walked out of the quiet alley. The youth wore bright purple robes. However, for some reason, the purple robe on his body gave off an ethereal and illusory feeling. His entire aura was the same. It was illusory and ethereal, like a piece of cloud. Sitting on the doorstep, Yi Jingnan's pupils contracted violently. He saw the youth's face clearly. This youth had a clean face. He looked a little young and inexperienced, but he gave him an exceptionally terrifying and dangerous feeling, causing the blood in his body to surge violently. In his impression, even when he saw Jing Liuli for the first time, he only felt the pressure and awe of a mountain, but not this feeling of danger. Who was this youth? His breathing began to stop. Jing Liuli was different from him. The moment she saw this youth, she knew who this person was. In all of Chongling, other than Ding Ning, only one person could make her feel like this. And Baosher, her brows furrowed slightly as she looked at the young man who was floating over like a cloud, and said, "Don't worry." Behind her, Su Heshan was also stunned. Just like how Jing Liuli's appearance in Chongling was enough to shock all of Chongling, the appearance of an Baosher of Lingshu Swordgate in Chongling meant that something unusual had happened. The purple-robed youth smiled. This smile gave him a human presence, like he had landed on the ground from the clouds. But when a person from the sky landed on the ground, he still did not seem to be in the human world. So while he was real, he gave off an eerie presence. "I am in Baosher." He looked at Jing Liuli, who did not disguise her enmity. Without any courtesy, he asked directly, "Do you know why all of Chongling placed us side by side, but I never left Lingshu's sword gate to find you?" Jing Liuli looked coldly at him and said, "I do not know." And Baosher said, "Because I always feel that you are not as good as me. I do not think I need to go out of my way to prove myself." His tone was ordinary, and his expression was indifferent. He did not seem proud at all, but he gave off a very proud feeling, so proud that even Su Heshan, who was half a head taller than him, felt he was looking up at him. Jing Liuli was not angry. She looked at him and said, "And now?" And Baosher glanced behind Jing Liuli. "Now, there is someone who can stand side by side with me, so you are no longer a match for me." Jing Liuli laughed and said, "So you mean that in the future, I am not even worthy of standing side by side with you, so you came to tell me?" And Baosher looked at her smiling but cold face and shook his head seriously. "I came out of Lingshu's sword gate to see Ding Ning's fight." He shook his head and then said in an emotional tone, "Since Ding Ning dares to challenge Palace attendant Rome, he has a chance of winning. With his cultivation, even if there is just a chance of winning, it is worth coming to see in my view. But you also surprise me. You do not have a sword, but your sword essence is much stronger than before. It seems that you have improved greatly in these days in Chongling, so much so that I can test your sword." Hearing these words, Yi Jingnan and Su Heshan's bodies unconsciously tensed again. This was undoubtedly a challenge. Enough shocking things had happened today. Now, when everyone thought the show was over, a legendary person like an Baosher actually appeared in front of them. All of this was as unreal as the dim light in front of them. Also, they knew that Jing Liuli would not avoid a challenge like this. In the span of a breath, Jing Liuli nodded and said, "All right, Chi La." A small tear suddenly appeared on an Baosher's purple robe sleeve, but his expression did not change. He was like a son of God from the kingdom of heaven. He still had no proud expression, but he gave people the feeling of extreme pride. He still nodded and said to Jing Liuli, "Please." Jing Liuli narrowed her eyes slightly. She naturally sent out the sword essence she had accumulated. There was no disturbance in front of her, but any natural seal lines that flowed with energy in the air seemed to be her sword essence. Her sword seemed to be everywhere in the world. Her sword seemed to exist in any invisible seal line in the world, and could appear in any seal line at any time and fall towards an Baosher's body. This was the true sword essence of the Great Freedom Sword. There was no sword, but an Baosher was surrounded by swords. This was undoubtedly Jing Liuli's strongest attack, so strong that Su Heshan's body started to tremble. Only now did he understand how strong Jing Liuli, hailed as the monster of Chongling's younger generation, was. The world was filled with swords. How could he stop this attack? Yet an Baosher just stood there motionlessly. He was clearly standing there, but it was as if his entire being had become empty. Everything was empty. Everything was empty. Even if the sword fell, it would only hit empty space. Jing Liuli took a deep breath and then slowly exhaled. The sword essence in the world disappeared. This is the supreme spirit void? She seemed to be talking to an Baosher, but also seemed to be talking to herself. And Baosher looked at her and nodded naturally. The two seemed to have never fought, but victory was decided. Jing Liuli's sleeves were cut off at the shoulders, revealing two white lotus-like arms. And Baosher's expression did not change, and he gave off an eerie and inhuman presence. He did not look at Jing Liuli again, and looked past Jing Liuli at the courtyard behind her. Then he turned and left. The light in the open space dimmed slightly. Watching his back as he left, Yi Jingnan and Su Heshan looked at the motionless Jing Liuli and suddenly felt slightly sad. This was because they felt that Jing Liuli would be very sad right now. But unexpectedly, when Jing Liuli turned and sat back down on the steps, it was as though nothing had happened. She did not feel any sadness. Chapter 398. A bright moon was reflected in the well. In the Yin Xanadu, next to this well of Celestial Seal sect, Johnny was resting and rubbing his slightly swollen right shoulder. Carrying water was not a difficult task for cultivators like him. However, the paths in some places of Celestial Seal Sect were very different from the paths of the outside world. Carrying water in those places was much more difficult than ordinary people carrying water on the mountain paths. "Why are you not sad?" A familiar voice reached his ears. He knew it was Su Qin. He slowly turned around and looked at Su Qin, who was walking in the darkness, somewhat puzzled. Su Qin looked coldly at him and stood at the other end of the well. Then he repeated, "Why are you not sad?" Zhang, he was slightly shocked, but out of courtesy, he responded, "Why should I be sad? You have the best cultivation in White Goat Cave and are favored by your teachers. During the Min Mountain Sword Trials, you obtained a chance to enter Min Mountain Sword Sect to study. In Chongling, you are outstanding. But here, you are the worst of the worst. Just this month, you were punished to carry water 7 times. Su Qin said with slight disdain, "The people who joined the sect with you entered the 3rd Dao Hall at the very least, but you have not even comprehended the seal essence of the 1st Dao Hall. Do not tell me you are not sad." Zhang, he finally understood, but his gentle expression did not change much. He was certain that Su Qin could not understand him. He was very polite, but he knew it was useless to speak to someone like Su Qin who could not understand him. So he closed his mouth and did not speak. Sometimes, the gentle silence of people like him was disdain and resistance in other people's eyes. Su Qin looked at him, and his brows slowly furrowed. "Look at this seal," he slowly said to Zhang Yi. "This is one of the 30 seals of Celestial Seal Sect." After saying this, his left hand moved slightly. Several cracking sounds came from the wooden bucket beside Zhang Yi. Zhang Yi glanced at the bucket, then turned to look at Su Qin's left hand. He was shocked, and his face paled. The water in the bucket beside him didn't move at all, but several cracks appeared on the wooden bucket, and water slowly flowed out from within. Su Qin's left hand was still strangely twisted. It was still a crippled hand that could never hold a sword again. But Zhang Yi clearly sensed that the seal essence came from his left hand. Looking at Zhang Yi's pale face, Su Qin laughed happily. Stones from other mountains can be used to polish jade. The twisted flesh and meridians can't use swords anymore, but they can use different talisman intents. Can you understand the feeling of seeing the light at the end of the tunnel? Congratulations, Zhang Yi said. He did not like Su Qin anymore. Even though the other had once been his respected junior sect brother, his congratulations were still sincere. He thought, if Su Qin benefited from the disaster, and this crippled hand allowed him to use more powerful talisman intents, then his hatred towards his favorite junior sect brother would lessen greatly. But he was too kind and did not understand people like Su Qin. Su Qin listened to his congratulations, and his smile gradually disappeared into cold disdain. Right now, Celestial Seal Sect only has this bucket. When you carry it up the mountain, half of the water will leak out, so you will have to carry twice as much water as usual. Even if you don't stop from now on, you will have to carry until the middle of the night. You will be dispirited in the morning test tomorrow, and probably will not pass. Then you will have to carry more water. You say you are not sad. But I do not believe you will not be sad if you continue to be at odds with these 2 buckets of water and these mountain paths. After saying this coldly, Su Qin turned and left without looking back. Zhang Yi still could not understand Su Qin, but he did not go to the teacher to complain. He felt that there was no meaning in arguing with the teachers of Celestial Seal Sect just to carry more water. But the time would be limited, so he did not rest and continued to carry water. The clear well water seeped through the cracks in the wooden bucket and dripped onto the mountain path covered in moss. Su Qin was right. The moon was high in the sky, and he had not finished carrying water. His shoulders were red and swollen, not to mention the carrying pole. Just the touch of his clothing and the weight of the clothing caused him heart-wrenching pain. His steps grew heavier, so heavy they shook off some of the dry moss on the mountain path. The water droplets on the wooden bucket, and his sweat kept falling, soaking many dry places on the mountain path. He was still persisting. His expression was gentle and not impatient. But all of a sudden, his eyes were filled with shock. He saw many strange, silver rays of light. The silver rays of light were very weak and came from the dozens of stone steps that he found most difficult to walk on the mountain path. These faint silver rays of light came from where the dry moss had fallen off. The silver rays of light on each step formed a profound and indescribable character in his eyes. He still could not understand the meaning of these characters. Because he could not understand, he could only see the most superficial shapes of these characters. Looking at the shapes of these characters, the vital energy in his body that was suppressed by the strange power coming from the stone steps seemed to follow the shapes of these characters and flow through his body, forming a strange cycle. His vital energy started to slowly flow through his body. Under the restraint of a power several times his own, his vital energy started to flow. Vital energy could flow, so he could use it. The water he carried on his shoulders started to lose power under the support of his vital energy. Then Zhang Yi's breathing stopped, and he was even more shocked. The characters formed by the silver light coming from these stone steps clearly formed a method of vital energy flow. Combined with the power of these steps, he could feel his vital energy flow slowly, but it seemed to grind through many places in his body and cause his body to undergo some qualitative changes. This vital energy method was many times stronger than the vital energy method he cultivated in White Goat Cave. He couldn't help but stop in his tracks. The moon passed the middle of the sky. The silver rays of light on the stone steps started to disappear. It looked like those characters had never existed. Zhang Yi began to understand that it was the water that flowed out of the bucket and his sweat that was enough. The moonlight was bright enough when the moon was in the middle of the sky. Only then could the traces on the stone steps shine with a faint silver light. But why were there these marks on the stone steps? How could there be such a cultivation method, and why didn't any of the teachers mention it? Zhang Yi could not understand. Of course, he did not know that an old man he knew, but did not know his identity, was looking at him from a grass hut on the other side of the mountain path, his eyes filled with gratification and emotion. Celestial Seal Sect had many powerful seals, but in reality, the strongest seals left behind by generations of sect masters were hidden in the mountains and rivers of Celestial Seal Sect. Many people spent their entire lives searching for powerful methods against enemies in those records and lesson plans, but did not find even one true seal. Was it because those people's heads were too high, and they always looked at the sky? They wanted to fly into the sky, and were not willing to look down at the path. Or was it because of something else? Regardless, before the summer had passed, Zhang Yi had obtained one of the most important true seals of Celestial Seal Sect. This old man was very satisfied, and was certain his decision was correct. After the moon passed the middle of the sky, the moonlight started to dim. In an alley in Xanadu, several barks could be heard. The capital of the Yin dynasty had been through hundreds of years. While there had been changes, it had not undergone drastic changes like the Qin dynasty's Chongling. So the buildings were of different heights, the alleys were of different width, the new and old buildings were scattered, and looked like the old and new were intertwined. The prosperity and new life of 100 years caused this capital to be very artistic, but also made the night even more complicated. An outsider with a follower was not familiar with this alley. He stepped on a puddle of water. It stained his shoes. His follower nimbly avoided all the puddles that could stain his new shoes. His shoes were clean. The dog stopped barking. Many figures were gathered at the two ends of this complicated alley. The outsider seemed to have expected this. He bowed to the front, his voice slightly tired and weak. Just begging for food. Masters, please make it easy. Chapter 399. Xanadu is in chaos. It is not easy for outsiders to make a living in Xanadu. A faint voice sounded. It sounded like a senior who was full of sympathy for a junior. However, in the next breath, the voice suddenly turned stern. Every word was as cold as ice. The 7th Street and 16th Alley is very big. It is easy to say that we want to give up a small piece of land. However, if we want to give up a piece of land, it will make things difficult for us. It might cause a disaster. The outsider smiled faintly and said, So after thinking about it, why don't you all work together to deal with me? This will not be difficult in your view. Interesting. The harsh voice quickly turned serene. As the figures in the alley ahead parted, a thin old man in a wheelchair walked to the front. We know you are a dragon crossing the river. The retainer behind you should be Realm 7. Otherwise, Old Chi and the others would not have died without making a sound. The old man smiled serenely. But the 7th Street and 16th Alley are so large. A Realm 7 wants to suppress us. This kind of thing is not likely to happen. If you are negotiating, you will not block the path behind us. At least, you will give us a way out. The outsider smiled and said, "We did not even see a patrol along the way. Since you have made such a connection, it seems that the following matters will not be interesting." The old man raised his head in surprise and looked at this foreigner. "You're very smart, but how could you not realize that without General Zhang's order, there wouldn't be any patrolling soldiers in 7th Street and 16th Alley tonight? Since you understand General Zhang's intentions, why did you not leave in the night and come? Maybe you have misunderstood General Zhang's intentions. If he did not want me to stay here, then he would not have given me a chance to come here tonight." The outsider looked strangely at the old man and sighed. "Old Bai of Chaotian sect, you have stayed in this position for too long. You have forgotten how you came to this position in the past. You should change your thinking." The outsider paused and said regretfully, "Perhaps you've forgotten that no matter how firmly you sit in this position, it's still because the true nobles in Xanadu let you sit there. What you have to do is to first satisfy them. I'm here tonight, in front of you, perhaps because those nobles think that you've been sitting in this seat for too long and don't know how to think anymore. Maybe they feel that you're not doing a good enough job and need a new butler, or maybe they just want to see something new." The old man's faint voice did not sound immediately. He was silent for a long time. Then he slowly nodded and said, "If the nobles already have such thoughts, then the only way to dispel them is to prove that I can still sit in this position. I have to prove that I am stronger than they think." The Outlander shook his head and sincerely said, "This is not the only way. I hope you can consider a gentler way. I'm already old." The old man's voice grew faint. "I am willing, but the people in front and behind me will not be willing to give my position to an outsider like you. I need to prove my abilities to those nobles, but you also need to prove your strength to all of my brothers." The Outlander thought for a moment and wanted to speak. However, at this moment he heard several shrill and piercing sounds. "The flying swords of Yindo are much weaker than Chongling." The Outlander sighed softly. He looked at the old man in the darkness and said more seriously, "You are already so old. Why are you still so impatient? Why do you do things so ruthlessly?" The old man in the wheelchair did not respond. For people like him, since the decision had been made, there was no need to say anything else. In the darkness, several flying swords flew towards the Outlanders with turbulence. The subordinates behind him swung their swords. There was a deafening boom. The multiple flying swords were swatted away in a breath. Cries of astonishment rang out. The old man in the wheelchair, who had just sunk into silence, suddenly looked up, his emotions shocked to the extreme. In his perception, the large sword of this Outlander subordinate was like an enormous hammer. Those flying swords were not just sent flying. They were completely destroyed. What astounding power was this? He knew that the subordinate was Realm 7, but the power the other used in raising his hand immediately proved to him that this subordinate was not an ordinary Realm 7. "I hope you can change your decision." The Outlander glanced at him and said in a serious tone. A green seal landed in front of him like a falling leaf, and then slowly released a presence that only Realm 7 could possess. A dark green flame ignited on the talisman. This seal was the true killing move. Those multiple flying swords were vicious, but they only drew away the subordinate's sword for a moment. Yet at this time, to the shock of the old man and the many people blocking the alley, a crimson sword appeared in the Outlander's hand. With just a flash of sword light, this outsider's body shook fiercely. However, that green talisman was sent flying by this sword, breaking in half. The cut of the green seal was very thin, but unimaginable flames came out of it. All of the yuan qi that had gathered gushed out from this fracture. The two astounding green streams of fire collided in the sky and pushed the two remnant seals dozens of feet to the sides. The green but bright light illuminated the faces of everyone in the alley, including the old man in the wheelchair. The old man's wheelchair was shaking violently. He looked at the two rivers of fire in the sky, even his wrinkles giving off green light. He screamed in disbelief like a child who had been bullied in a fight. "How is it possible? You are also Realm 7. At this time, a sword light lit up behind the old man. The sword light was dim when it first appeared, but in a flash, this sword light was like a burning iron rod, shockingly bright and hot. One of the old man's subordinates screamed in fury and turned to attack. His sword was very fast and very strong. Everyone around him, including the old man he was protecting, believed he could stop this sword. But it was also at this moment that the sword, which was like a red-hot iron rod, suddenly changed direction and stabbed at this follower. The follower was startled. He felt an aura of desperation. He felt he would die. He pulled back his sword. However, with a swish, the attendant's body stiffened. He found this deadly sword essence was falling towards him, but the sword itself did not change direction. The burning iron sword stabbed into the old man's body from the back of the wheelchair. The tip of the sword came out of the old man's chest and gave off hot steam. The subordinate screamed in madness and confusion. He did not know why he could not stop this sword. The old man was also bewildered. He realized that regardless of whether it was the follower's earth-shattering blow or the outsider's sudden display of Realm 7 strength, they were just a cover for this last blow. But even now, he did not understand why this outsider, who had not been Realm 7 in the battle not long ago, had reached Realm 7 in such a short period of time. He could not understand why this sword was not strong and was able to stab into his body. "Apologies." The outsider bowed to him from a distance and apologized sincerely. "If you do not die, many people will die." Sensing that the people in the alley were so shocked they could not move, the subordinate behind the outsider put down his sword and said softly, "Wang Taishu, you also surprise me. Actually, this is largely due to what one person said to me." The outsider knew that everything was settled. He put away his sword and stood with his hands behind his back. He shook his head and responded, "Before I left Chongling in the end, he told me that the key to a breakthrough was not talent, but the strongest emotions." The subordinate behind him stilled slightly and seemed to understand. The outsider said softly, "At the beginning, I did not understand. Later, when you traveled with me and felt your sword essence at close range, and we were further away from Chongling, I gradually understood. Cultivators like you are often able to reach very high realms in the end because of national grudges and family grudges. Your love and hatred are much richer than ordinary cultivators. Your emotions are much fiercer than ordinary cultivators. The fiercer your emotions are, even your perception seems to be stronger. Human emotions are, after all, the most powerful force in this world." The follower behind him thought seriously. He thought of the most outstanding and powerful cultivators of the Zhao and Chongling in those years. He thought that none of them seemed to be fawning, and all of them seemed to be people with true personalities. He felt this was even more reasonable. Chapter 400. When the moon passed the middle of the sky, the night was the darkest, but it was also the busiest time in Chongling's fish market. In a room filled with agarwood incense, a black bamboo grew in solitude and then quietly disappeared. The woman in red robes stood in front of the window with a zither. Her gaze was covered by layers of dark rain, but her mind was cast towards the places where the battles had occurred today. She had a faint sadness on her face, as usual. She thought of the two women who had fought hard on the Wei River and lost their country. She thought of the sword that the eldest miss of the Gongsun family had used today, and her emotions grew stronger. Another stalk of black bamboo appeared out of thin air behind her. However, unlike before, it did not disappear as she breathed. Instead, it suddenly bloomed into a deep red flower. As the bamboo blossomed, a mysterious change occurred in her body. Her skin quickly turned pure black, like the black bamboo, and then quickly faded. She was no different from usual. However, the darkness in her eyes was larger than usual, making her eyes look even darker and brighter. The black bamboo in the shadows outside the room also began to shake violently. The old servant who usually followed her knocked on the door and entered. He looked at her, but was silent. He knew she could have had a breakthrough long ago, but she had not. This was akin to an invisible contract with the nobility of Chongling, so that Chongling would give her a place to stay. That day, when Bai Shanshui and Zhao Si fought on the Wei River, I felt it. The old Shang family servant did not speak, but she started to speak. Her tone was still extremely gentle and sorrowful. Both of them lost their countries and families. Thinking about it, I am the same. My family is gone, and I am a lonely ghost in Chongling. I will always be a thorn in their side. Today, so many things have happened. How can I not care for myself? The old Shang family servant was silent for a moment and said, Miss still remembers the grudge of your family. I remember the grudge of my family, and the kindness I received, the red-robed woman said softly. After living peacefully in Chongling for so many years, at least I know that if that person had not hurried back then, the Shang family would not have many people left. I am a lonely woman and have no hope of revenge. The grudge has faded, but I remember the kindness. Today's restlessness is because of the 9-death silkworm. She turned to look at the Ben old servant and said, Bai Shanshui, Zhao Si, and that eldest Miss Gong's son. What kind of people are they? If not for the 9-death silkworm, I do not believe they would burn their vital energy like this today. As long as the 9-death silkworm existed, Chongling could not be peaceful. In the end, we will not be able to stay in Fish Market and struggle at death's door. Whether or not we are that kind of people, Zheng Xie will think of us as that kind of people. After all, to her and Yuan Wu, we're just small fish that escaped the net back then. The old Shang clan servant was silent for a long time. In the end, he let out a long sigh and said no more. There were Realm 7 Grandmasters who died, but people silently had breakthroughs and became Realm 7 Grandmasters. The winds and clouds changed, and there were countless grievances. This was the true Chongling. Mo Shouqing walked into the tiger and wolf army camp. Huang Jinwei followed behind him respectfully. Some of the officials of the Divinity Bureau silently spread out, leaving the area where the enormous spears had fallen and the snowstorm that even Realm 6 could not enter. In the center of the camp, Liang Lian's body was still lying where he had died. The ice and snow on his body had disappeared. In the hot summer, the ice and snow had turned into water and seeped into the ground under him. His body had become shriveled, and the black color had seeped into his body. He did not look like a general who had just died in battle, but a dried corpse that had been dead for many years and then dragged out of the mud. Mo Shouqing stood in front of Liang Lian's corpse in silence for a long time. In the end, you were someone who fought for the Qin dynasty. As he said this, he grabbed a large flag from the distance and covered Liang Lian's corpse. It is the 9-death silkworm. Then he turned around and nodded at Huang Jinwei, saying, Don't worry. Huang Jinwei's eyes were filled with shock. He knew that if even this old man was so certain, it meant that the 9-death silkworm was not an illusion. It truly existed, and had grown to such an astounding level that it was able to kill Liang Lian. Mo Shouqing nodded again and said, What killed him was a line of heaven, one of that person's strongest sword essences. It can cut a line of heaven and earth in front of any great power. Huang Jinwei could not speak and could only listen. Mo Shouqing continued, The one who killed Liang Lian is not Realm 7. To be able to use such a sword essence before Realm 7 back then, that person was only able to comprehend such a sword essence when he was Realm 7. Huang Jinwei was even more speechless. He could not believe that there was someone more talented than that person back then. Perhaps that person already had a successor many years ago, but that successor never revealed himself. Maybe that person took in a disciple long ago, and even the Empress did not know. His matters were not told to the Empress. Unlike usual, Mo Shoqing did not give Huang Jinwei much time to think. He continued, "The Empress will go crazy." Huang Jinwei suddenly looked up. He could not think of all the meanings contained in the words, but just the words Empress seemed to cause him to feel a cold presence. The 9 Death Silkworm and the 9 Hell King sword appeared at the same time. Bai Shanshui killed Su Fanqin. Zhao Si drew away the Empress sword, and the 9 Death Silkworm entered and left through the underground river. These are not isolated. Mo Shoqing looked straight at Huang Jinwei and slowly said, "The only thing in the world that can mess with the Empress' mind is the 9 Death Silkworm. If she knew who the heir to the 9 Death Silkworm was, there would not be much trouble. But now, the heir to the 9 Death Silkworm is unknown and far stronger than she imagines. I worry about her the most. I worry about what she will do next." Huang Jinwei's face started to pale. He thought of many past events in Chongling 3 years before the Yuanwu Emperor ascended the throne. He finally started to understand what his teacher was worried about. The Holy One is Realm 8, and his government is harmonious. The Qin dynasty is unprecedentedly strong. Even if the 9 Death Silkworm has reached this level, even if Bai Shanshui and the people of the Zhao Sword Furnace are growing stronger compared to the present Qin dynasty, they are still too weak. Mo Shoqing knew he understood, but still continued. After the Deer Mountain Conference, the threat of the other 3 dynasties is gone, and the Empress has no restraints in her actions. If she wants to be cruel, she will become even crueler. Huang Jinwei's breathing grew difficult. "Teacher, then what should I do now?" Mo Shoqing looked at his beloved disciple, a hint of affection and emotion in his eyes. He sighed softly and said, "Investigate. Find out who the 9 Death Silkworm is." After a slight pause, he turned to look at Liang Lian's corpse covered by the large flag and said, "Come here to kill him. There will be a way in and out. There will be traces. Only by finding out who truly received the inheritance of the 9 Death Silkworm will the Empress not go crazy." Huang Jinwei felt puzzled. Was it not the Divinity Bureau and the Astrology Bureau to investigate? Why did his teacher want him to investigate? But he was one of the wisest people in Chongling, so he quickly understood the old man's meaning. "Teacher, you do not trust the Divinity Bureau and the Astrology Bureau? In Chongling, never trust anyone too much." Mo Shoqing smiled bitterly and said, "Also, I do not have much time." Huang Jinwei looked at his eyes that suddenly dimmed and turned yellow. His heart tightened and he shouted in shock, "Teacher!" Mo Shoqing waved his hand and said softly, "At most 3 more months." Hearing these words, Huang Jinwei was haunted by great pain. He didn't dare to believe that this was true. He didn't dare to believe that this old man who had guarded the city for many years was really going to leave this city. However, he knew that this matter was incomparably real. "Because I do not have enough time, everything must be done quickly." Mo Shoqing said softly and seriously, "Just like a candle, someone will think of ways to use its last light to do something." Chapter 401. But in this day and night, too many shocking things happened in Chongling. Ding Ning, who had just reached Realm 5, killed Palace Attendant Rome, who was peak Realm 6 in a duel. The Empress, who had been living in the Imperial Palace, left the palace because of this, and many people saw her face. Then all the wells in Chongling churned with red water. Supposedly, the great bandit of Cloud Water Palace, Bai Shanshui, had returned to Chongling and killed a grandmaster of the Qin dynasty. Even more shocking news came at the end. The general of the Tiger and Wolf Army, Liang Lian, was assassinated in the camp of the Tiger and Wolf Army. For the ordinary people of Chongling, such a matter was unprecedented and inconceivable. Yet for the people who truly stood at the top of Chongling, Liang Lian's death meant that something that had been circulating was true. That person's 9 Death Silkworm had an inheritance. The 9 Death Silkworm had started to take revenge. Unlike Mo Shoqing, most of the cultivators in Chongling were not as wise and rational as him. Even though 3 years before the Yuanwu Emperor ascended the throne, the history books of the Qin dynasty had started to erase all traces of that person. For a long time before that, that person was still a legend in the hearts of most cultivators in Chongling, and someone they worshipped. His sword was enough to defeat the heroes of the world when every battle had the most perfect woman in the world, defeated 3 dynasties, and made the Qin dynasty the strongest dynasty in the world. Such a person disappeared from Chongling because of a simple betrayal and a long bloody suppression. Many people could not resist and silently accepted this reality. Yet many times, when they thought of that person's name and dared to mention that person's name, that person was still the symbol of invincibility in their minds. Even if he died in battle in the end, how many Realm 7 swordsmen had died at his hands? That person was invincible. Making people feel invincible would give people confidence. The faint moonlight refracted in the clear crystals, turning into blurry rays of light that landed on the Empress, standing in front of the spirit lotus pond. A man in cloth robes walked from the path she faced until he was next to her. He looked with her at the lotuses in the spirit energy mist. In all of Chongling, only one man could have such an attitude. He was naturally the Yuanwu Emperor. Don't worry about the 9-death silkworm. What is dangerous is not the 9-death silkworm itself, but the people's hearts. What are you going to do? There's one thing I've always wanted to do, but I've never done it. All the cultivation practitioners in these cultivation places of the Qin dynasty can be recruited into the army at will and fight for the country. How do you plan to implement it? The Yuezhi have submitted, and only the Wuji remain. If we conquer Donghu, we will have no future trouble when we fight the Yin and Qi. The conversation between the two of them was extremely plain, like the most ordinary conversation between an old couple who had been on the streets for many years. However, the tone of the two of them carried an undeniably powerful aura. If the content of their conversation were to be spread out, it would be enough to cause an endless storm. Cultivators were existences above the mortal world, and had certain privileges in the mortal world. Most of the cultivation places that did not have any connection to the court had extraordinary status. So even though White Goat Cave had merged into the Green Vine Sword Academy, it had caused many things. Even Ding Ning's killing of Palace Attendant Rong, in many people's view, was White Goat Cave's victory in resistance. Many cultivators would enter the army to train and cultivate because of their sex, or because their senior brothers and uncles were serving in the Great Qin Army. In the end, they would even stay in the army for a long time and become a general in the army, making great contributions to the army. Most of the generals and officials in the Qin dynasty's army and court came from such a path. When military rewards were directly linked to killing enemies, gradually, most cultivators entered cultivation places for the sole purpose of making contributions, and eventually being conferred the title of Marquis. Especially for some cultivators whose ancestors had no military achievements and came from poor backgrounds, this desire was even more urgent. So this was a process of habit becoming natural. Yet at this moment, the most powerful empress in the history of the Qin dynasty was talking about forcibly changing this natural process. Using the court's orders to recruit cultivators of a cultivation place into the army to fight, this was no different from the court taking control of all cultivation places. If all the cultivation places learned of this, they would be shocked and furious. Yet these cultivation places did not know that long ago, after the Bazin Kendo ground disappeared, the man and woman standing by the Spirit Lotus Pool had the idea of implementing such an order to all the Qin dynasty cultivation places other than Min Mountain Sword Sect and Lingshu Sword Gate. After so many years, this idea had not stopped. Also, other than Mo Shoqing, who already had hidden worries, no one in Chongling would think that the Empress would start a war of the entire country to implement a certain order. Yet the Emperor, dressed in cloth robes next to her, did not even frown. He thought and said in a calm tone, "Wait a little longer." The Empress thought about it and nodded without any objection. The Yuanwu Emperor held her hand and stood quietly for a long time. Before leaving, he said peacefully, "Do not care about the past." The Empress was silent for a moment and said, "I only care if you will always stand by my side." The Yuanwu Emperor smiled and said, "Do not doubt." The Empress also smiled. Yet when the Yuanwu Emperor's figure finally disappeared from her sight, her smile disappeared. Her perfect face had a porcelain cold sheen that made people suspect that her smile had never appeared. If you do not care, why mention caring? She looked at the swaying lotuses in the spirit lotus pool and thought scornfully inside. In the night, Ding Ning coughed violently and spat out several mouthfuls of blood. The 9 Hell King sword and the 9 Death Silkworm had appeared at the same time. When they released the power that had been dormant for many years, his meridians had suffered unimaginable damage. If he did not have the heaven-replenishing divine art, he would have died. As he struggled to adjust his breathing, the invisible little silkworms in his body began to appear in the most severely injured parts of his body. They even gathered together to replace the broken meridians and forcibly allow the vital essence of the heaven-replenishing divine art to circulate. Liang Lian was dead. Realm 5 was here. But he knew that reaching Realm 5, he was like a rich man who had used up most of his savings. From Realm 5 to Realm 6, it would not be as easy as before. He would need a lot of time. For him, the best solution now was to leave Chongling, and even leave the Qin. But before the great floating water prison was broken, he had to stay in Chongling. Even more importantly, where could he find a strong enough Realm 7? I want to tell Shenxian some things. In the deepest water of the great floating water prison, Lin Zhujiu looked up, his seaweed-like hair leaving a trail of water behind. No one responded to him. Lin Zhujiu smiled scornfully and said, I want to tell him about the secrets of the bone characters in the tea garden. Still, no one responded. However, a figure quickly appeared in front of him. You are one of Zheng Xiu's confidants. Now, that palace attendant is dead, Su Fanqin is dead, and Liang Lian is dead. Are you afraid? Looking at Shen Xian, who was like a gray tower in the darkness, Lin Zhujiu laughed. Shen Xian did not answer, but he could not help but take a deep breath. He could not calm down. He could not understand. In these years, Lin Zhujiu had been locked in this deepest water prison, cut off from all contact with the outside world. The only person who could touch him was himself. The water that connected to this water prison had been specially processed. Even the frequency of vibration and the characteristics of the energy had been changed. But in these years, Lin Zhujiu was still able to know what was happening outside, and even what had happened today. In this moment, he really believed that Lin Zhujiu could read people's minds. But he was one of the coldest people in Chongling. So his eyes did not change, and his voice did not change. You said you would tell me the secrets of the bone characters in the tea garden. It should be that Zheng Xiu wanted to stabilize my sworn brother. She was extremely gentle for a night, and used many secret arts. Lin Zhujiu laughed out loud. In the water dungeon next door, there was also a weak laughter. Shen Xian's expression changed. It could be seen in the darkness. Lin Zhujiu laughed even louder. If I tell you I guessed, what would you feel? The night I know the bone characters, my sworn brother was in Chongling, and should have gone to meet her. You and Wu should also know that my sworn brother was in Chongling that night. If I guess like this, do you think he will guess like this? Do you think he cares? Chapter 402. In these years, Shen Xian had always wanted to extract the secrets of those people from Lin Zhujiu's mouth. Lin Zhujiu was the recognized strategist of the Bazin Kendo ground people. Many things had been arranged by him, even though in the end, because of that person's death and the betrayal of many people, everything had become chaotic and uncontrollable. But everyone believed that he had controlled some things and left behind some things of those people. He himself was a treasure. But when Lin Zhujiu told him such things, Shen Xian's body grew colder than Lin Zhujiu in the Yin water. The palace attendant who followed Zheng Xiu for so many years and never betrayed her is dead. Liang Lian, who helped her kill many dissidents, is dead. Su Fanqin, who helped her assassinate many people, is also dead. You're also one of her people. You feel you can escape such an ending? Looking at the silent Shen Xian, Lin Zhujiu smiled and said, You want to know my secret, but if I say my secret, are you sure you dare to listen? Shen Xian slowly looked up at Lin Zhujiu in the water and did not speak. He turned and walked outside. Either you die because of the secret, or you will stay here forever and never see the light of day like the prisoners here. Lin Zhujiu also looked up at his back and said, "You want to leave here and take the place of some people outside, unless I also leave here." Shen Xian did not respond. Silently, he walked out of the innermost water dungeons and stopped by an iron bridge, pondering for a long time. He knew that some of Lin Zhujiu's words were psychological attacks, but he also knew that some of Lin Zhujiu's words were correct. You should believe a little. The 9-death silkworm has never lost. Wang Jingming lost because he believed in Zheng Xiu and Yuan Wu. But now, the 9-death silkworm is still here, and the target of the battle is Zheng Xiu and Yuan Wu. Are you sure that Zheng Xiu and Yuan Wu will win in the end? At this time, Lin Zhujiu's voice sounded. Lin Zhujiu's voice was unprecedentedly loud, coming from the deepest prison and clearly reaching his ears. My promise is more effective than Zheng Xiu and Yuan Wu. Do you want to hear my promise? Yi Zhengnan sat on the steps of the clinic. A carriage appeared in his line of sight, and his eyes immediately became alert. However, when this carriage stopped, when he sensed the dark and moldy presence coming from the person who walked out of the carriage, the wariness in his eyes turned into shock and awe. He didn't say anything. He just stood up and lowered his head to make way. This person could not be stopped. It was impossible for him to stop them, because this person was the head of the Divinity Bureau. Even though it was summer, Chief Inspector Chen still wore a thick robe as he walked out of the stuffy carriage. The robe was crimson, but the crimson color couldn't hide his pale face. The dark and moldy aura followed his footsteps into the medical center and spread to the room where Ding Ning was. Feeling this presence, Ding Ning felt slightly uncomfortable. He coughed, but still managed to prop himself up with difficulty. He grabbed a soft cushion and leaned against it, waiting for the arrival of this prison chief. Chief Inspector Chen ordered the 2 doctors guarding the door to open the door, and then indicated for the 2 doctors to leave. He slowly pushed open the door. He walked in a few steps and looked at the youth on the bed. His expression did not change, and his eyebrows rose slightly. He was certain that the other knew his identity, but the youth's expression was still calm, so calm that no emotions could be seen. So he did not waste words and said, "I have come to see you for a routine inspection. Including the palace attendant you killed, many things have happened in Chongling. So I have to come to see you." After a slight pause, he looked at Ding Ning and said, "I have to make sure you are fine. If my guess is correct, Wen Howling will come to see you soon." Ding Ning nodded and said, "Please do as you wish, Chief Inspector." Chief Inspector Chen nodded. The moldy smell in the air suddenly grew stronger, and some moldy spots appeared in some dark corners. A very uncomfortable presence came from Chief Inspector Chen and landed on Ding Ning. Chief Inspector Chen sensed very carefully. Dozens of breaths later, he nodded again. The moldy spots that grew in the dark corners of the room quickly dried into a layer of faint gray-white dust. This method is very wondrous, as expected of the best in the world. After saying this, he turned and prepared to leave. Ding Ning looked strangely at him and said, "How are you sure it is me?" Chief Inspector Chen did not look back and said coldly, "I understand Yi Sealing." Ding Ning frowned slightly and said seriously, "Why are you helping me?" Chief Inspector Chen had walked out of the door. He looked up at the sky and said, "I am only helping Yi Sealing. It should not be just that." Ding Ning shook his head and said, "Otherwise, with your cultivation, Bai Shanshui would not have been able to escape that day." Chief Inspector Chen stilled. He knew that the other knew his true cultivation from the presence he showed just now. He shook his head, and a self-deprecating smile appeared at the corners of his mouth. "That is still to help her and myself. Chongling always needs strong enemies. Otherwise, our existence is meaningless." Ding Ning laughed self-deprecatingly. "It seems that she and Yuan Wu are too strong and always make people unhappy. One mountain cannot accommodate many tigers." Chief Inspector Chen continued to walk and said calmly, "The strongest emperors in the history books who were said to have created the world will not have anyone close to them in the end. There will only be many people who can only look up to them. This is a very natural process." Chapter 403. Some people like to drink hot, and some like to drink cold. Midsummer was about to pass. The temperature in Chongling was still very high during the day, but the nights were clearly cooler. The jade cup was filled with grape wine, chilled with ice cubes. The outside of the jade cup was covered with cold dew. The fruit plate in front of the cup was filled with washed fruits of various colors. Fireflies were dancing in the garden in front of the cup. The black-robed man, whose face showed no signs of age, raised the wine cup. He did not drink, but slowly licked the wine in the cup. His lips and teeth were as red as blood. Although it was just an ordinary black silk robe, in terms of nobility, there were few people in the entire Chongling who were above him. Because this nobility was not only accumulated from countless years of living a life of luxury, but also from countless years of natural accumulation of life and death. He was the person who had led Zhang Yi to Celestial Seal sect, the leader of Chongling's old nobility. Most people in Chongling did not know of his existence. Even those who knew of his existence did not know his true name, and habitually called him Yi Xiao. Zheng Xiao is a crazy woman. If she does not go crazy, it is just that she has not been provoked enough. She does not have many people around her. Coincidentally, I do not like when howling. If she goes crazy, what will we do? She will be in chaos. Yin will be too deep. She will be just right. A gentle middle-aged scholar sat next to the black-robed man. The two had only spoken a few words, but these few words were enough to affect all of Chongling. After slowly licking the wine in the cup, the black-robed man stood up and disappeared into the night of Chongling. It was another bright moon in the sky. In Celestial Seal sect, Zhang Yi was not punished, but he still carried water. When he walked through that part of the mountain path, there was no more silver light. He walked steadily, and the water in the bucket did not leak out. His steps were no longer heavy. While he did not understand the meaning of those seal scripts, he naturally understood the channels through which vital energy flowed in his body, and that vital energy method. This kind of true essence cultivation method, combined with the mysterious power of the mountain path, made his body more and more tenacious, more and more powerful. In just a few short days, this change was enough to shock him. Some ordinary sharp weapons, even if they were made of iron, would only leave a shallow white mark on his skin. Celestial Seal sect was a shocking place. It was just that his body had undergone a shocking change under this powerful true essence cultivation method, but his comprehension of Talisman Tao was still stagnant, and he was still the worst among the disciples who had entered the sect. This still made him feel a little ashamed. The looming white light on the mountain path in front of him interrupted his thoughts and attracted his attention. It was the faint glow of a slime. Zhang Yi stopped and looked over. At first, he was surprised and puzzled. The thing that left this glowing slime was a small snail. It looked like a very ordinary snail, but there was something special about the mountain path here. Even low-level cultivators might not be able to walk normally. How could an ordinary snail pass through and leave behind such a trail? Zhang Yi stared blankly at the snail that was still slowly crawling on the stone steps. He stared at it for a long time and finally began to understand why. Because this snail's body was very soft. This snail was crawling very slowly, much slower than usual. Yet the slower it was, the longer it stayed on the stone steps, the more obvious the trail it left behind. In the many years of cultivation in the past, Zhang Yi had not used any tricks. He had relied on hard work and concentration to cultivate step by step and improve. He rarely had an epiphany. However, at this moment, there seemed to be a flash of light in his mind. He seemed to be struck by lightning. He inexplicably gripped a sword in his sleeve. This was a very short sword that looked like stone. It was the sword that Shui Wangshu had left for him. At the same time, a powerful sword essence so sharp it caused his mind to feel pain appeared in his mind. Then there was the glowing trail left behind by this snail. His mind pushed his vital energy, and it flowed naturally and slowly into the sword in his hand. He did not sense it, nor did he see it. But the stone sword in his hand flashed, and shards of light scattered, as though someone had used a hammer and chisel to carve a mark on the sword. When Zhang Yi obtained the epiphany that all cultivators dreamed of in Celestial Seal sect, Ding Ning was not healing. He was waiting and thinking. There was a person called Wen Howling next to Zheng Xiu. He would not appear most of the time, but when Zheng Xiu appeared on the battlefield and used the starfire sword that fell from the sky, he would follow Zheng Xiu like a shadow. Always leaving a move behind was Zheng Xiu's style of doing things. Whenever she appeared on the battlefield, she would only appear at the most crucial moment. She would only appear when she revealed her sword. When Howling, who had followed her on the battlefield as a close attendant, was her move and was naturally very powerful. When Howling was also one of the cultivators who had betrayed that person on the Bazinkindo ground. Even though he had set up such a trap, so that everyone in Chongling would naturally separate him from the Nine-Death Silkworm, because he was so outstanding and incredible. Even though Zheng Xiu had come to see him in person, she was still worried and had Wen Howling come. Even Chief Inspector Chen was certain that Wen Howling could not sense Ding Ning's abnormality. But Ding Ning was not worried about this. He was worried about his own emotions. He was worried that he would unconsciously show hostility. Even if he controlled his emotions well, his body's unconscious reactions could still reveal many things. Wen Howling had been Zheng Xiu's shadow attendant for many years. He was best at observing this. But why had Wen Howling not come yet? Even Chief Inspector Chen knew he would come. Why had he not come yet? A carriage stopped in front of the wine shop in Falling Parasol. A middle-aged man whose fingernails were well maintained walked out of the carriage. Why did you come here first? It was also at this moment that a faint, yet inexplicably noble and dignified voice drifted from the surrounding darkness. The middle-aged man who walked out of the carriage was Wen Howling. He was wearing a light yellow robe, but the energy waves he emitted seemed to want to drag the shadows of countless things around him into his body and devour them. This presence was enough to terrify many Realm 7 cultivators. But at this time, hearing the voice coming from the surrounding darkness, Wen Howling's expression changed slightly. When a cultivator stays in one place for a long time, they will leave behind some traces. Leave behind some traces that even they do not care about. He pondered for a moment before replying. Then he asked, "Why did you come here? What do you think?" A scornful laugh came from the darkness. Originally, she had many people she could use, but recently, there have been fewer and fewer. I want to see how she will feel when there are fewer and fewer people around her. Wen Howling frowned deeply. "You dare to kill me here?" The voice in the darkness was cautious. "I want to try." Wen Howling grew silent. "Because the Nine-Death Silkworm has appeared?" The person in the darkness laughed. "Of course. Then try." Wen Howling shook his head. He didn't make any extra movements, and his body didn't emit any light, but all the dark shadows within a radius of 1,000 feet around him seemed to be sucked into his body at this moment. The area within 1,000 feet around him suddenly became bright. However, his face also turned deathly pale at this moment. A black thread silently entered his body as the shadows shrank. He only noticed it after it entered his body. This was a profound battle between Realm 7s that could not be described in words. Powerful energies were fighting in the clouds. A black-robed person was behind him, almost standing next to him. In this moment, Wen Howling saw this black-robed person clearly. The other's presence was stronger than his, and his features were more handsome. Even his fingernails were more finely trimmed. In this moment, he felt ashamed of his inferiority. He was inferior in every aspect. The reason you people have repeatedly failed against the so-called Great Rebels is because you always rely on Chongling, rely on others, but do not think that your own life and death need to be controlled by your own hands. The black-robed person said and looked up. He narrowed his eyes. A powerful presence came down from the distant turret, turning into a terrifying sword essence that was falling down. Wen Howling let out a shrill scream. Countless black rays shot out from his eyes, and in the next moment his body exploded. The moment his body exploded, countless balls of black light exploded from many places in this alley. The terrifying sword essence coming down from the distant turret cut through a ball of black light. The black light immediately disappeared, leaving behind a deep mark on the ground, and a patch of blood as cool as the wine in the jade cup. Chapter 404. The morning light was bright again. A familiar presence appeared in Ding Ning's perception. He did not understand. It should have been when Howling who came. Why was it Yi Sealing? The door was pushed open. He sensed a gaze on him. He looked towards this gaze and saw Yi Sealing still dressed in a white dress. But for some reason, her white dress was much brighter today. This was not the first time he and Yi Sealing met, but her gaze today was very different from usual. When Howling is dead, Yi Sealing looked at him and said softly. She did not look like she was going to leave soon. She closed the door, sat down at the table across from him, and waited for his reaction. Ding Ning stilled slightly. This was something he had not expected. He was very familiar with When Howling, and knew that not many people in Chongling could kill him. Yi Sealing looked at his slightly furrowed brow, his puzzlement but calm appearance. This face was very different from a certain person in her impression. But for some reason, her heart beat faster. Yi Xiao did it? Yi Xiao can kill him? Ding Ning's expression was grave. But when he thought of Chief Inspector Chun, he could not help but laugh in self-mockery. Chongling is full of hidden dragons and crouching tigers. It seems that many people are skilled at concealing themselves. Some people are much stronger than I imagined. When Liang Lian was killed by the 9-death silkworm, everyone in Chongling knew that you were here. So in the eyes of everyone in Chongling, you cannot be related to the 9-death silkworm. Even the marquises of Chongling are guessing that he took in a disciple long ago. That disciple is not young. Otherwise, he could not have comprehended the sword essence of one-line sky. Yi Sealing looked deeply at Ding Ning. But I know who you are. Then, who are you? I know who you are. Who are you? These two sentences sounded very contradictory, but Ding Ning's calm face was no longer calm. Because a drop of water fell from Yi Sealing's cheek. It was not a condensation of Yuan Qi, but a crystalline teardrop. In this world, the most powerful force was always the most intense emotions between people. Ding Ning's heart was struck by this powerful force. He fell silent and lowered his head. What's the point? He was silent for a long time. He did not directly answer Yi Sealing's question and only replied with this sentence. Yi Sealing looked at him and smiled. His smile was slightly bleak. You know why I had to stay in Chongling. You know how many things I did not want to do in order to stay in Chongling. Do you feel there is meaning in me asking this now? Ding Ning said, You know he's dead. I originally thought so as well. Yi Sealing also lowered his head like a child who needed warmth in the cold winter. I just wanted to see if he had left behind an heir and what the heir wanted to do until I saw you. You are too young. I know Xin Xian is at least correct in his bone age. You were born 3 years after his death. Your true cultivation is only Realm 5. Then how do you know so many things, know so many people, and know the sword essence of one-line sky? Yi Sealing still did not look up, but his tone grew more urgent. No one understands the sword essence of one-line sky better than me. I do not believe that no one other than his personal students can comprehend such a sword essence. If the body turns to dust and nothing is left behind, what way is there to bring the dead back to life? Ding Ning smiled, but his smile was bleak. You believe in things like bringing the dead back to life? Yi Sealing looked up at him and said seriously, I hope there is such a thing as bringing the dead back to life. There is still no meaning. Ding Ning's expression hardened. He slowly said, Even if I come back to life, I will not be the person you are familiar with. Yi Sealing suddenly laughed. The sadness in her eyes disappeared, and she laughed like a child. Some things will change, but some people will not. She looked at Ding Ning and said slowly, There is no meaning in arguing about this. I came here because I have something important to tell you. The prison-breaking team has gathered. Ding Ning suddenly tensed as though he had a premonition. He asked, Who is it? Yi Sealing glanced at him and said, Fish Market, the eldest daughter of the Shang family. Ding Ning coughed in pain. This was what he did not want to hear the most, but it was as he had a premonition. It seems that you do not want her to participate in something like this. Yi Sealing's smile grew brighter, and even seemed seductive. But this is her own choice. Just like me staying in Chongling, it is my own choice and has nothing to do with you. Ding Ning stilled. Starting from many years ago, Zhengxiu has not suffered any losses since she entered Chongling, but she has suffered too much in the last few days. Now that when Howling is dead, she will do something else. Yi Xiling looked at Ding Ning and said, Yi Xiao, the person most unwilling to leave Chongling, is willing to leave Chongling. People like me are tired of Chongling long ago. So if you are worried about our safety, save Lin Zhujiu as soon as possible, and do not hesitate. Ding Ning slowly nodded and said, Tomorrow. Yi Xiling walked out of the clinic and boarded the carriage waiting for her outside. The carriage started to move. She did not put down the curtain and looked at the walls and roof tiles along the way. The sun was rising. The faint, golden sunlight shone on the gray walls and black roof tiles, reflecting a solemn light. She looked further into the distance at the towering turrets. A self-deprecating smile appeared at the corners of her mouth. These arrangements of the past have become means to restrict myself today. Moments later, looking at this, she sighed. Chongling really is majestic. No matter what, the people who built such a majestic city in the past were great. Back then, when those people had succeeded, she had still been a young girl. When she had first awakened to love, those people had died. She had always felt that she was half a beat slower. Now, things were still the same, but it was not too late. She tapped her hand on the window of the carriage. The carriage slowly passed through the streets and finally moved towards a very old bridge. This was an old bridge that was rarely used for carriages in Chongling. It was only used for the convenience of the surrounding shops. Even the bridge under the bridge was dilapidated. On one side of the bridge, there was a rare pomegranate tree that grew. Even this pomegranate tree was very old. On one side of the bridge, there was a fragrant oil shop. Next to the fragrant oil shop was a tofu shop. Between the two shops was a narrow alley. There was a blind fortune teller sitting on a bamboo chair. The blind fortune teller was not old, just in his 30s. He was also very clean, like a scholar. He did not have a strange presence, so he did not appear to have any business. She walked straight to the blind fortune teller, walking from his side to behind him. She said, "Where is your stringless zither?" The blind fortune teller did not respond. She retreated until she was in front of the blind fortune teller. Then she looked into his eyes and smiled. She said, "You really are a fake blind and deaf." The blind fortune teller looked at her and suddenly trembled. Do not have any special reaction. Yi Xiling took a deep breath and quickly repeated, "Where is your stringless zither? Come with me." The blind fortune teller did not hesitate. He stood up and walked into the alley. There was a small shack in the alley. He walked all the way into the courtyard and into the only bedroom. The blind fortune teller's body seemed to be freed and started to tremble violently. His eyes lit up. He looked at Yi Xiling's lips so seriously it felt perverse. 9 death silkworm. Yi Xiling said simply, and then said, "I need you to tell Lin Zhujiu to save him tomorrow. I also need you to try to get someone into the great floating water prison." Chapter 405. The alley was as secluded as falling parasol. Most of the people living here were poor people at the bottom of Chongling society. Unbridled laughter could be heard coming from a small wine shop. In the small wine shop, the one who served the dishes and cooked was a woman. There were no helpers. Although there was only one table of guests at this time, this woman was alone. She was so busy that she was sweating all over. Even her coarse clothes were sticking to her body. This woman was somewhat beautiful, but the guests at the table were somewhat impudent. They constantly looked at the snow-white skin on her neck and her drenched clothes. This made her extremely embarrassed, but she didn't dare to show it on her face. Her face only became redder and redder. Seeing her like this, the guests at the table became even more unbridled and shouted even louder. At this time, a person came to the door. This was a gardener. The people in the surrounding streets knew this gardener, and only knew that his surname was Zhang. He made a living by helping several wealthy families take care of the flowers and plants. He usually did not save much. He was also dark and strong, and did not vomit easily. So he should be in his 40s, but no girl liked him, and he was still alone. If a person like this appeared at the door, he would not attract the attention of the guests at the table. But today, when he appeared at the door, the laughter and chatter of the guests at the table suddenly stopped. This dark-skinned, short, and stout gardener was holding a large pair of flower shears. His trousers were still covered in mud. He didn't look any different from usual, but there was a faint smile on his face. No one in this area had ever seen him show such a smile. Even the woman in the wine shop stilled. Inexplicably, she sensed his intentions. She sensed that this smile gave off a feeling she had not seen for a long time, and even started to feel joy for him. In a strange silence, this gardener Zhang walked up to that table of customers, and then said to the leader of the group, a short-haired man in embroidered clothes, "You owe a total of 23 times for food and drinks. Pay for this meal first." This short-haired man in brocade robes was clearly not a kind person. He stilled, and then a cold smile appeared at the corners of his mouth. But in the next moment, this short-haired man felt an enormous terror press into his body. He found that he could not move. "Pay for the drinks and leave." Gardener Zhang looked at him and said again. The short-haired man suddenly realized that he could move. Shocked, he took out a money pouch from his sleeve. Without even looking at it, he placed it on the table and walked out of the shop. The companions beside him were dumbfounded. They didn't understand why he had such a reaction, because they didn't even feel a trace of a strange aura. When they followed the short-haired man out of the shop in confusion, the silver-clothed man suddenly stopped. He looked at his lower body. He had lost control of his bladder. At this moment, what was flowing out from his lower body and soaking his clothes was scarlet blood. His companions' eyes widened to the extreme. Before this embroidered-clothed, short-haired man released a scream of shock. These companions were already screaming in shock. The short-haired man finally let out a miserable shriek. Then he collapsed and died. "I'm afraid I won't be able to help you in the future." In the wine shop, Gardener Zhang looked deeply at the woman and said softly, "If I do not die in the future, I will take you out of Chongling." At the same time, the short-haired man in embroidered robes let out a miserable shriek. The woman in the wine shop paled and did not react to what had happened. When Gardener Zhang turned and left, and she looked at his honest back, she started to realize the meaning of the other's words. She finally realized that the other was not an ordinary person. She was an ordinary person. But when Gardener Zhang took a few more steps, she found courage from somewhere. Her pale face flushed red as she shouted, "I will wait for you." Gardener Zhang laughed. He did not pay attention to any other sounds or the gazes of other people on the street. His figure disappeared like a ghost at the corner of the street. The death of an ordinary gangster would not immediately cause such a great reaction. After passing through a few streets and alleys, he slowed down his pace and walked slowly with a pair of scissors in his hand, just like how he usually tended to the flowers and plants. There were many peach groves in the east of Chongling. The peach groves grew on small hills. If it was spring, the peach blossoms would be bright and beautiful. The peach blossoms in the paintings of many famous painters in Chongling came from here. Right now, the last batch of peach blossoms were ripe. Naturally, there were no more peach blossoms. But inexplicably, in the valley shrouded in white mist, there were still many peach trees blooming. When the peach blossoms were blooming, there was not a single new leaf. There was only a small stone stele in front of the valley, but the entire valley was quiet. Even the painters of the nobility did not dare to enter this valley, because there were two words written on this small stone stele: Imperial Restriction. These two words came from the Yuanwu Emperor's hand. Gardener Zhang's figure appeared in the peach groves and walked towards this valley. He did not seem to see this stone stele at all. He walked directly into the valley and passed through the blossoming peach trees. In the center of the most beautiful peach groves, there was a quiet little courtyard. There was a very handsome man in the courtyard, as beautiful as a peach blossom. "Yi Xinhe, I had not expected you to still be alive." Gardener Zhang held a pair of scissors and came to the front of the courtyard. He looked through the open door at the handsome man and said, "Back at the Deer Mountain Conference, you should have known that I was still alive. So I should be the one to say this. Zhang Shiru, I did not know that you were still alive." The handsome man looked at the gardener in surprise. Gardener Zhang smiled. It is better to be dead than alive. Yi Xinhe looked at him and frowned. He said, Zhang Shiwu, I do not seem to have any grievances with you. Gardener Zhang shook his head and said, Not distinguishing right from wrong is the greatest grievance. Yi Xinhe looked at Gardener Zhang and laughed. Putting aside the fact that you were not my match at Bomb Mountain, even if you kill me now while I am injured, do you think you can leave? Gardener Zhang also laughed and said, I want to give you a fair chance, but right now, I only want to kill you. As to whether I can leave, I have not thought about it. Yi Xinhe looked up and slowly said, Pity that you cannot kill me today. Gardener Zhang seemed to feel something, but he did not speak. His gaze landed on Yi Xinhe's throat. The flower scissors in his hand split apart. It had originally been a pair of scissors, but after splitting apart, it became two swords. The two swords flew out of his hand. They looked like ordinary flying swords. However, the moment they flew out, one of the two swords that were originally silver and bright turned pure snow white, while the other turned pure black. The swords were yin and yang. This gardener was the former yin-yang sword master of the Bazin Kendo ground, Zhang Shiwu. Just as the swords flew 10 feet away from him, all the peach blossoms in the valley withered. The withered petals fell down. Everything in the courtyard around Yi Xinhe shattered and danced in the air like the petals of the fallen peach blossoms. A rotating and endlessly growing sword essence had already landed on his body. Yi Xinhe's black hair danced. A wooden sword floated in front of him. This wooden sword had a very powerful aura, even more powerful than his yuan qi. However, there were already many cracks on the sword's body. Crash! An enormous snow-white light flashed down from the sky and collided with the black and white whirlpool that had wrapped around him. His lips and teeth were bright red, and bright red blood seeped out, as if there were several peach blossoms in his mouth. But in this moment, he laughed and looked at the mountain behind Zhang Shiwu. There was a rumbling sound. A door seemed to open in the world. A part of the mountain wall shattered. Countless rocks flew out from the white fog. A chariot that seemed to be made of pure bronze charged out of the white mist with a terrifying presence. The general on the chariot was covered in blue-scale armor, like a demon. Behind this war chariot, countless metallic lusters seeped out of the white mist. Chapter 406. Ordinary people only heard the thunderous booms and did not know what had happened. But the mountains were collapsing and the energies were in turmoil. This could not be hidden from the senses of powerful cultivators. What happened? The Empress' voice sounded from deep in the palace. Dozens of breaths after she spoke, a middle-aged man in yellow robes appeared outside her study. Zhang Shiwu wants to kill Yi Xinhe. It happened suddenly. When I reported, I had already moved the Dongling army. Now it should be the Dongling army fighting with Zhang Shiwu. The middle-aged man in yellow robes had his head bowed slightly, but his breathing and presence rippled violently. He clearly had come in a hurry to report. Zhang Shiwu? The Empress figure appeared near the middle-aged man in yellow robes. She looked expressionlessly at the Peach Valley. He is still alive? The middle-aged man in yellow robes did not answer her. After Palace Attendant Rong's death, he was the person who understood the Empress the best of everyone around her. So he knew he did not have to answer. Since Zhang Shiwu is still alive, why did he appear at this time? Did he want to kill Yi Xinhe because he only found Yi Xinhe recovering there now? The Empress said slowly. The yellow-robed, middle-aged man hesitated for a moment. Just as he was about to speak, the Empress continued to speak. Previously, neither the Astrology Bureau nor the Divinity Bureau detected anything. Unlike Zhao Zhan, who had a clue half a year ago and used half a year to find him in Chongling, the Empress was emotionless. Her expression was perfect. Today, we found that Zhang Shiwu is still alive, and the warden's office was able to move the nearby Dongling army in time. This is too much of a coincidence. If Zhang Shiwu died in the Peach Valley, then it is not a coincidence. If Zhang Shiwu did not die in battle and was captured alive by Yi Xinhe and the Dongling army, then it is not a coincidence. If Zhang Shiwu does not die, then he will be sent to the great floating water prison to Xinxian. The Empress did not need his answer. Her gaze moved away from the distance and landed on the yellow-robed middle-aged man. Then she said in a cold and powerful tone, "Have Amo Shochin go to the great floating water prison. Order the Tiger Wolf army to seal off the great floating water prison. Have General Bai personally lead the army to the great floating water prison, and send Zhang Shiwu back to the great floating water prison with Guidongshan." The middle-aged man in the yellow robe nodded and immediately turned to walk out. His breathing was still hurried, and his footsteps were also hurried. However, when he turned around, an inexplicable smile appeared on his face. The Empress was just making a hypothesis, but the order she gave had spun a huge net. Today, if anything happened to the Great Floating Water Prison, this net would bind everyone in the Great Floating Water Prison. No one would be able to escape. From the way she entered, the yellow-robed middle-aged man already felt that she was more terrifying than usual. He did not know if it was because the successive deaths of palace attendant Rong, Su Fanqin, and the others had caused her to recover her cold side, or because she was familiar with and understood her former enemies, but she immediately became more powerful than she had been 3 years before the Yuanwu Emperor ascended the throne. But no matter how terrifying she was, how unexpected her opponents were, no matter how perfect her net was, the most important thing was that the net could be made. And he was the one making the net. The Empress could not see the inexplicable smile at the corner of his mouth. At this time, even if this yellow-robed, middle-aged man was facing her, she likely would not be able to detect that this cultivator from the Jiaodong Commandery was different from usual, because she was very angry. The moment she turned around, her cold eyes flashed with anger once again. "Zhang Shu, even you are alive. How many of you, who should have died long ago, are still alive?" A general fell into the dust, fresh blood and broken flesh gushing out of his mouth. The thick scale armor on his body was in tatters. Many metal fragments were embedded in his flesh. The parts below his waist had been directly torn apart by a powerful force. The entire valley was filled with green metal fragments and broken limbs. There were also broken swords and shattered chariots. He was fated not to live. Just like his body, the army that had charged out of the white mist like a demon god army was also in tatters. All of this caused him great pain, but at this moment of death, his eyes were filled with joy and glory. Because Zhang Shiwu had not died. Zhang Shiwu had been captured alive. Yishina was sitting on the ground. There was a terrifying wound on his left rib, and one could even faintly see his organs. Even more terrifying was that a wave of energy was still surging in his organs. It would take a long time to suppress this power. His body was covered in blood, like all the peach blossoms in the valley had bloomed on his body. He looked at the dust dragon on the path outside the valley, his expression extremely unsightly. Not because of his wounds, but because he found that even if he had not been injured in the Deer Mountain Conference, Zhang Shiwu's cultivation would not be below his. A swordsman who had not been a match for him in the past was now above him. This made it difficult for him to calm down. In these decades of seclusion, your cultivation has reached such a level so strong that you were able to change the result of the Deer Mountain Conference. But a person like you is not willing to appear at the Deer Mountain Conference, and would rather appear now because of the news of the 9-death silkworm. Even if that person cultivated the 9-death silkworm to that level, he still died in Chongling. Now, Zheng Xiao and Yuan Wu are stronger than back then and control Chongling. What are you thinking? Do you not feel this is stupid? Zhang Shiwu, you are still alive? What about Yin? What about Mao Kikaji? Are they still alive too? The last thing he could not calm down was terror. If even Zhang Shiwu in the past could threaten his peach god sword, then the people who had disappeared when the Bazin Kendo ground was destroyed, and who had not been in his eyes at the time, were enough to kill him. When he finally suppressed the chaotic sword essence that had charged into his body, Yishina's body grew unusually cold. He thought of Liang Lian's death. The 9-death silkworm in Chongling brought hope and confidence to some people, but death and terror to others. The middle-aged man in yellow robes walked out of the imperial palace. After he walked out of the imperial palace, multiple cultivators in indigo robes started to fly at their fastest speed towards the various turrets. Multiple black eagles flew behind the middle-aged man in yellow robes towards the clouds in various parts of Chongling. Everything seemed to be the same as usual, but only he knew that the news that reached the hands of the key figures would be slower, and some of the content would be slightly different. Just like what the Empress was most skilled at back then. It was just that today, these methods that she was best at didn't achieve the result she wanted, but the result he wanted. He kept walking forward. His surname was Wang, so Yuan Wu did not like him. His name was Departure, but when he was in Jiaodong Commandery, he had started to serve the eldest miss of the Zheng family, Zheng Xiao, and had never truly departed. But during the Min Mountain Sword trials, he had gambled with him. So today, he decided to truly depart. He walked quickly out of the city. On the other side of Chongling, Shen Xian walked out of the great floating water prison. When the heavy thousand-caddy door opened, he appeared in the sunlight with his hands behind his back. The sunlight today was exceptionally blinding. He looked at the distant white path and narrowed his eyes into a line. Not only the Empress, but he also had a strong premonition today. So he was not waiting for someone, but looking at his own path. He was thinking one last time about how he should walk. You're tuning into the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.